The Earth of 130,000 years ago bore little resemblance to the frozen wasteland it would become. During this period, known as the Eemian Interglacial, our planet basked in warmth that exceeded even modern temperatures. Global mean temperatures ran 1 to 2 degrees Celsius higher than those recorded in the 21st century, transforming vast swaths of the northern hemisphere into lush, temperate landscapes where ice sheets had previously dominated. This thermal maximum represented the culmination of a gradual warming trend that had been building for millennia, driven by orbital configurations that concentrated solar radiation in the Arctic during summer months. The elevated temperatures triggered massive ice sheet collapse across Greenland and portions of Antarctica. Meltwater cascaded into the world's oceans, raising sea levels between 4 and 6 m above present-day measurements. Coastal regions that would later emerge as dry land during glacial periods remained submerged beneath warm, shallow seas. The Mediterranean expanded beyond its current boundaries, while the North Sea stretched further inland across what would become the British Isles and northern European plains. These higher sea levels created archipelagos where continuous land masses exist today, fundamentally altering migration routes for both animals and early human populations. The Scandinavian peninsula, freed from its burden of glacial ice, experienced rapid geological rebound as the Earth's crust adjusted to the removal of tremendous weight. Forests of oak, elm, and hazel colonized territories that had been locked under kilometers of ice for tens of thousands of years. The Baltic region transformed into a complex system of islands and straits, with dense woodlands extending far beyond the Arctic Circle. Even northern Siberia supported extensive boreal forests, creating continuous woodland corridors that stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Within this warmer world, early human populations occupied distinct geographical niches that reflected both environmental opportunities and the evolutionary trajectories of different hominin species. Homo sapiens, having emerged in Africa during the preceding interglacial period, had established robust populations across the African continent. These communities demonstrated sophisticated tool-making capabilities, producing blade technologies and composite implements that represented significant advances over earlier Acheulean traditions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Blombo's Cave and Pinnacle Point reveals populations engaged in symbolic behavior, creating ochre-based pigments and crafting ornamental objects that suggest complex social structures and abstract thinking. The distribution of these African populations reflected the continent's diverse ecological zones during the Eemian. The Sahara, periodically transformed into a green corridor during previous interglacials, began experiencing increased aridity as orbital cycles shifted. However, extensive river systems still drained northward through what would later become desert, supporting scattered communities of hunter-gatherers who exploited both aquatic and terrestrial resources. Lake Chad expanded to roughly 10 times its modern size, creating a vast inland sea that supported hippos, crocodiles, and diverse fish populations. These water bodies served as focal points for human settlement, providing reliable resources and serving as corridors for population movement between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean basin. Meanwhile, across Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthal populations had achieved remarkable success in colonizing diverse environments. These robust hominins, perfectly adapted to fluctuating climatic conditions, established communities from the Iberian Peninsula to the Altai Mountains. Their settlements clustered around cave systems and rock shelters that provided protection from seasonal weather variations. While their sophisticated tool industries enabled exploitation of both large game and plant resources, Neanderthal sites from this period reveal evidence of controlled fire use, systematic hunting strategies, and even rudimentary symbolic behavior, including the collection of unusual stones and shells. The Neanderthal populations of the Eemian displayed remarkable regional adaptations. In the Mediterranean regions, they developed specialized techniques for hunting deer, wild boar, and smaller game in dense woodland environments. Their lithic technology emphasized versatile scrapers and points suitable for processing both meat and plant materials. Northern European groups, facing more variable seasonal conditions, created more robust toolkits designed for processing large mammals and extracting maximum nutrition from available resources. These populations demonstrated intimate knowledge of their local environments, timing their movements to exploit seasonal abundance of nuts, berries, and migrating animals. The megafauna communities of the Eemian period represented some of the most spectacular animal assemblages in Earth's history. Straight-tusked elephants, massive creatures standing over 4 m at the shoulder, roamed the temperate forests of Europe and Asia. These giants, larger than modern African elephants, possessed enormous, curved tusks that could exceed 3 m in length. Their presence shaped entire ecosystems, creating clearings in dense woodlands and maintaining open grasslands through their feeding behaviors. Archaeological sites preserve evidence of these elephants' interactions with human populations, including possible hunting sites where Neanderthal groups may have scavenged or actively pursued these massive prey animals. European river systems during the Eemian supported populations of hippos that had expanded far beyond their modern African range. These semi-aquatic giants wallowed in the Thames, Rhine, and other major waterways, creating muddy banks and shallow pools that supported diverse aquatic ecosystems. The presence of hippos in Britain and Northern Europe required year-round water temperatures significantly warmer than modern conditions, indicating the profound climatic differences of this interglacial period. Alongside these aquatic giants, European rivers supported straight-tusked elephants that came to drink and bathe, creating dynamic interactions between terrestrial and aquatic megafauna. The mammalian diversity of Eemian Europe rivaled that of modern African savannas. Giant deer, with antler spreads exceeding 3 m, inhabited the forest margins and open woodlands. These impressive cervids, also known as Irish elk despite their widespread distribution, represented the pinnacle of antler evolution, with males carrying elaborate, branched structures that served both as weapons and displays of genetic fitness. Aurochs, the massive wild cattle that would later give rise to domestic breeds, formed herds that moved seasonally between woodland pastures and river valleys. These powerful bovids stood nearly 2 m at the shoulder, with bulls displaying aggressive territorial behaviors that shaped grazing patterns across the landscape. Cave bears, substantially larger than modern brown bears, occupied extensive cave systems throughout Europe. These massive ursids, with skulls exceeding 75 centimeters in length, demonstrated specialized adaptations for plant-based diets, though they retained the physical capabilities for occasional carnivore. Their cave systems often overlapped with Neanderthal occupation sites, creating complex relationships between human and bear populations that range from competition for shelter to possible hunting interactions. The predator guilds of the Eemian included species that would become extinct before the end of the glacial cycle. Cave lions, larger than modern African lions, hunted in the open woodlands and grassland margins. These powerful cats possessed robust builds adapted for taking down megafauna prey, including young elephants, rhinos, and large deer. Spotted hyenas maintained extensive populations across Europe, their bone-crushing jaws enabling them to exploit carcasses left by both human hunters and large predators. The presence of these African-adapted species in European ecosystems underscores the dramatically different climatic conditions of the interglacial period. Beneath this biological abundance, astronomical forces were already beginning to shift toward configurations that would trigger the next glacial period. The Earth's orbital parameters, governed by complex interactions between eccentricity, obliquity, in precession, we're entering phases that would reduce summer insolation in the northern hemisphere. Milankovitch cycles, named after the Serbian mathematician who calculated their climatic effects, operate on timescales of tens of thousands of years, creating predictable patterns of glacial and interglacial periods. During the Eemian maximum, orbital eccentricity had created conditions that amplified seasonal contrasts in solar radiation. The Earth's elliptical orbit brought the planet closest to the Sun during northern hemisphere summer, maximizing the solar energy available from melting ice and maintaining warm temperatures. However, this configuration was gradually shifting as gravitational influences from Jupiter and other planets slowly altered the Earth's orbital characteristics. The obliquity cycle, reflecting changes in the tilt of Earth's rotational axis, was beginning its transition towards reduced axial tilt. Lower obliquity values decreased the seasonal contrast between summer and winter, particularly at high latitudes where ice sheets form. This reduction in summer warmth would prove crucial for ice sheet initiation, as snow and ice that accumulated during winter months would increasingly survive through the following summer seasons. Precession cycles, governing the timing of seasons relative to Earth's position in its elliptical orbit, were shifting toward configurations that would place northern hemisphere summer at the point of greatest distance from the Sun. This astronomical arrangement would reduce the solar energy available for summer melting, creating conditions conducive to permanent snow accumulation in high latitude and high altitude regions. The combination of these orbital changes created a gradual cooling trend that became apparent in marine sediment records and ice core data from the later Eemian period. Ocean temperatures began their slow decline from interglacial maxima, while ice sheets in Greenland and northern Canada started accumulating mass for the first time in over 10,000 years. These changes proceeded almost imperceptibly on human timescales, but they represented the beginning of a climatic transition that would reshape the entire planet over the following millennia. The transition from Eemian warmth occurred with deceptive gradualness. Ocean surface temperatures dropped by fractions of degrees each millennium, while winter snows lingered progressively longer in the mountains of Scandinavia and the Canadian Arctic. What began as subtle shifts in seasonal patterns accelerated into dramatic environmental transformation as orbital mechanics drove the planet toward its next major glaciation. By 115,000 years ago, permanent ice fields had established themselves across northern Quebec and Labrador, marking the nascent stages of what would become the Laurentide ice sheet. The initial accumulation zones formed in the highlands of eastern Canada, where elevation combined with latitude to create conditions favorable for year-round ice retention. The Torngat Mountains and the Labrador Plateau became focal points for snow accumulation as moisture-laden air masses from the Atlantic deposited heavy snowfall across these elevated regions. Unlike the temporary winter snow cover of the Eemian, these deposits persisted through increasingly cool summers, gradually compacting into dense firn and eventually glacial ice. The transformation from loose snow to solid ice occurred through a process of repeated melting and refreezing, creating layers of dense material that reflected sunlight and further cooled local temperatures. As ice thickness increased, the accumulated mass began flowing outward under its own weight, following the natural topography of the Canadian Shield. The ancient Precambrian bedrock, worn smooth by previous glaciations, provided ideal surfaces for ice sheet expansion. Valleys carved by earlier ice advances channeled the growing glaciers southward and westward, creating ice streams that moved at rates of several meters per year. These early ice flows carved distinctive grooves and striations into the underlying bedrock, evidence that remains visible across the Canadian landscape today. The mechanics of ice sheet growth followed predictable physical principles. As ice thickness exceeded several hundred meters, the immense weight compressed the lower layers, creating conditions where ice behaved as a viscous fluid. This plastic deformation allowed the ice mass to spread horizontally, extending its margins far beyond the original accumulation zones. The advancing ice front bulldozed loose sediments, incorporating rock debris that enhanced the glacier's erosive power. Rains of mixed stone and soil accumulated at the ice margins, creating distinctive landforms that marked the maximum extent of glacial advances. Simultaneously across the Atlantic, the Fennoscandian ice sheet began its own dramatic expansion for nucleation centers in the Norwegian mountains. The Scandis Mountains, running along the spine of the Scandinavian peninsula, provided the initial accumulation zones where persistent snowfields gradually transformed into active glaciers. Unlike the relatively uniform topography of the Canadian Shield, Scandinavia's complex mountain geography created multiple ice domes that eventually coalesced into a single massive ice sheet. The Fennoscandian ice expansion followed the natural drainage basins of northern Europe, with major ice streams flowing down the Baltic Depression and across the North European plain. The advancing ice encountered less resistance than its North American counterpart, as the relatively low-lying terrain of northern Europe offered few topographic barriers to glacial advance. Ice streams carved deep valleys through the crystalline bedrock of Finland and Sweden, creating the distinctive fjord landscapes that characterize modern Scandinavia. The growth of these continental ice sheets triggered cascading environmental changes that extended far beyond their immediate margins. The most dramatic consequence involved global sea level, which began dropping as increasing quantities of water became locked in terrestrial ice. The relationship between ice volume and sea level operates through simple mass balance. Every cubic kilometer of ice represents approximately 900,000 cubic meters of water removed from the ocean system. As the Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets expanded to cover millions of square kilometers with ice hundreds of meters thick, the cumulative water withdrawal created unprecedented exposure of continental shelves. By 100,000 years ago, sea levels had dropped approximately 40 meters below modern levels, exposing vast areas of previously submerged terrain. The English Channel began emerging as a broad river valley, with the Thames and Rhine systems converging into a single drainage network that flowed northward across the exposed Doggerland Plain. This emergent landscape, stretching from eastern England to the Netherlands and beyond, created a continuous land bridge that connected the British Isles to continental Europe for the first time in over 100,000 years. The exposed Doggerland region developed into a complex ecosystem of rivers, lakes, and grasslands that supported diverse plant and animal communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that this land bridge became a crucial corridor for both animal migrations and human population movements. The terrain consisted primarily of fertile alluvial deposits left by retreating seas, creating ideal conditions for the establishment of grassland communities that could support large herbivore populations. Even more significant for human migration patterns was the emergence of Beringia, the land bridge connecting Asia and North America across what is now the Bering Strait. As sea levels dropped beyond 50 meters below present levels, the shallow waters of the Bering Sea retreated, exposing a landmass nearly 2,000 kilometers wide at its maximum extent. This exposed terrain, technically a continuation of the Siberian and Alaskan continental shelves, created an unbroken pathway between the old and new worlds. Beringia represented more than a simple land bridge. It constituted a distinct biogeographical province with its own characteristic flora and fauna. The region supported extensive grassland communities dominated by sedges, grasses, and herbs that could tolerate the harsh continental climate. These plant communities, adapted to cold temperatures and strong seasonal variations, provided the foundation for what ecologists term the mammoth steppe ecosystem that would dominate much of northern Eurasia and northwestern North America throughout the glacial period. The mammoth steppe represented a unique ecosystem without modern analogs, characterized by extremely high productivity despite harsh climatic conditions. The plant communities consisted primarily of cold-adapted grasses and herbs that grew in dense mats, creating a continuous carpet of vegetation across vast areas. Unlike modern tundra, which supports relatively low animal biomass, the mammoth steppe sustained enormous populations of large herbivores through a combination of high plant productivity and efficient nutrient cycling. Woolly mammoths emerged as the dominant megafauna of these grassland systems, their massive size and specialized adaptations making them perfectly suited to exploit the abundant plant resources. These impressive elephantids, standing up to 3.5 m at the shoulder, possessed dense undercoats of fine wool covered by long guard hairs that provided insulation against temperatures that regularly dropped below 40 degrees Celsius. Their curved tusks, reaching lengths of 4 m in mature males, served multiple functions, including snow removal, bark stripping, and intraspecific combat during mating seasons. The mammoth's feeding behavior shaped entire landscapes through their impact on vegetation communities. A single adult mammoth consumed 300 kilograms of plant material daily, requiring constant movement across the landscape to avoid overgrazing any particular area. Their feeding patterns created a mosaic of habitats, with heavily grazed areas alternating with less disturbed zones that supported different plant species. The animal's massive feet, measuring over 40 centimeters in diameter, compacted snow and soil, creating pathways that other animals followed, and they influenced drainage patterns across the landscape. Woolly rhinoceros shared these grassland habitats with mammoths, though their feeding strategies focused more heavily on woody browse and coarser vegetation. These massive ungulates, weighing up to 3,000 kilograms, possessed distinctive flattened horns adapted for sweeping snow away from buried vegetation. Their thick, shaggy coats provided insulation comparable to that of mammoths, while their broad, flat feet distributed weight effectively across soft ground and snow. The presence of both mammoth and rhinoceros populations in the same habitats suggests remarkable productivity in these ancient grassland systems. The establishment of periglacial environments extended far beyond the immediate ice sheet margins, creating distinctive landscapes characterized by permanently frozen subsoil and seasonal freeze-thaw cycles. These periglacial zones, extending hundreds of kilometers south of the ice margins, supported unique geological processes that shaped terrain in ways visible across modern landscapes. Frost wedging split bedrock along natural fractures, creating extensive talus slopes and boulder fields. Solifluction, the slow downslope movement of water-saturated soil during brief summer thaws, created distinctive lobed and terrace landforms. The development of permafrost across vast areas of northern Eurasia and North America fundamentally altered hydrological systems. Surface water could not penetrate the permanently frozen subsoil, creating extensive wetlands and shallow lakes during summer months. These water bodies supported diverse aquatic ecosystems and provided critical habitat for migratory waterfowl and other wildlife. The permafrost also preserved organic material with exceptional fidelity, creating the fossil deposits that provide modern scientists with detailed information about Pleistocene ecosystems. During this period of environmental transformation, human populations faced unprecedented challenges and opportunities. Homo sapiens communities in Africa continued developing increasingly sophisticated technologies and social systems, while also beginning tentative expansions beyond their continental homeland. Archaeological evidence from sites like Kafsa and School Caves in the Levant documents the presence of anatomically modern humans in the eastern Mediterranean region by approximately 100,000 years ago. These early human expansions into the Levant represented significant achievements in adaptation and technology. The migrants possessed advanced lithic technologies that included carefully prepared blade cores and composite tools incorporating multiple materials. Their toolkits demonstrated remarkable standardization across different sites, suggesting well-developed cultural traditions and possibly symbolic communication systems that enabled the transmission of complex technical knowledge. The Levantine populations encountered environmental conditions markedly different from their African origins. The region experienced increased aridity as global cooling reduced monsoon strength and altered precipitation patterns. However, the eastern Mediterranean retained sufficient moisture to support woodland and grassland communities that could sustain human populations. Archaeological sites preserve evidence of systematic hunting strategies targeting deer, gazelles, and other medium-sized game, along with intensive exploitation of plant resources, including wild cereals and legumes. More significantly, these expanding Homo sapiens populations encountered established Neanderthal communities that had occupied the Levant for tens of thousands of years. The archaeological record suggests complex interactions between these different human species, with evidence of both competition and possible technological exchange. Some sites show alternating layers of Neanderthal and modern human occupation, indicating that control of favorable locations shifted between populations over time. The Neanderthal populations of this period demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of changing environmental conditions. The communities across Europe adapted to increasingly harsh winters and shortened growing seasons through technological innovations and behavioral modifications. Cold-adapted tool technologies emphasized efficient processing of animal resources, with specialized scrapers and knives designed for high preparation and bone marrow extraction. These tools enabled Neanderthal groups to maximize nutritional return from hunting activities, while also producing materials necessary for clothing and shelter construction. Neanderthal settlement patterns during the early glacial period reflected careful adaptation to seasonal resource availability. Many groups established base camps and cave systems that provided protection from harsh weather, while maintaining networks of temporary sites that enabled exploitation of seasonal resources. The distribution of these sites suggests sophisticated territorial systems and possibly coordinated hunting strategies that required complex social organization and communication. The technological capabilities of both human species continued evolving in response to environmental pressures. Composite tools incorporating stone, bone, and organic materials became increasingly common, enabling more efficient resource exploitation. Evidence for controlled fire use expanded dramatically during this period, with hearth sites showing sophisticated understanding of fuel management and heat distribution. These technological advances proved crucial for survival in increasingly challenging climatic conditions. As ice sheets continued expanding and sea levels dropped toward their glacial minima, the stage was set for even more dramatic environmental changes and human adaptations that would characterize the height of the last glacial maximum. The gradual cooling that had characterized the early glacial period was about to be interrupted by one of the most catastrophic volcanic events in human history. Deep beneath the tropical forests of northern Sumatra, geological forces had been building toward an explosive climax that would dwarf any volcanic eruption witnessed by modern civilization. The Toba caldera, measuring approximately 100 kilometers in length and 60 kilometers in width, represented the surface expression of a massive magma chamber that had been accumulating molten rock for hundreds of thousands of years. The eruption that occurred around 74,000 years ago released an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of magma, making it roughly 5,000 times larger than the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption and 100 times greater than the 1815 Tambora event that caused global climate disruption. The Toba event ranks as a VI-8 supervolcanic eruption, the highest category on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, placing it among the most powerful geological events of the Quaternary period. The explosion ejected material with such force that volcanic debris reached altitudes exceeding 50 kilometers, penetrating deep into the stratosphere where it could circulate globally. The initial phases of the eruption likely began with precursory earthquakes and smaller explosive events that would have been terrifying to any human populations within hundreds of kilometers. However, the main eruptive sequence unleashed destruction on a scale difficult to comprehend. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas, ash, and rock fragments traveling at speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour swept across the landscape in all directions from the eruption site. These deadly currents maintained temperatures above 800 degrees Celsius and possessed the density and momentum to surmount topographic barriers hundreds of meters high. Within a radius of 200 kilometers from the eruption center, virtually all life was instantly obliterated. The pyroclastic flows carbonized forests, boiled rivers, and buried the landscape under deposits reaching thicknesses of 600 m in some locations. The city of Medan, had it existed, would have been buried under 600 m of volcanic material. The flows extended across the Strait of Malacca, reaching the Malay Peninsula and covering areas that would later become modern Malaysia under meters of volcanic debris. The atmospheric injection of volcanic material created immediate and dramatic climatic effects across the entire planet. Fine ash particles measuring less than 2 micrometers in diameter remained suspended in the stratosphere for several years, creating a global veil that reduced incoming solar radiation by an estimated 25–90%, depending on latitude. This massive reduction in solar energy reaching Earth's surface triggered what volcanologists term a volcanic winter, a period of sustained global cooling that lasted between 6 and 10 years, according to various climate models. Temperature reconstructions based on ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica suggest that global mean temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius during the immediate aftermath of the eruption. However, regional variations were far more extreme, with some areas experiencing temperature deviations of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius below normal conditions. The Northern Hemisphere, already experiencing gradual cooling due to orbital cycles, faced particularly severe temperature reductions that pushed many regions toward conditions approaching those of the last glacial maximum. The climatic disruption extended far beyond simple temperature reduction. The massive injection of sulfur compounds into the stratosphere created sulfuric acid aerosols that not only blocked sunlight, but also altered precipitation patterns across the globe. Monsoon systems, crucial for supporting agricultural and natural ecosystems across Asia and Africa, weakened dramatically or failed entirely for several consecutive years. The Indian subcontinent, normally receiving life-sustaining seasonal rains, experienced severe drought conditions that persisted long after the volcanic ash had settled. These environmental catastrophes had profound implications for human populations that were already struggling to adapt to the challenges of an increasingly cold world. The Toba catastrophe hypothesis, first proposed by anthropologist Stanley Ambrose in 1998, suggests that the volcanic winter created conditions so severe that Homo sapiens populations were reduced to perhaps 1,000–10,000 breeding individuals. This proposed demographic bottleneck would represent the closest approach to extinction that our species has ever experienced. Genetic evidence supporting this hypothesis comes from studies of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome variations in modern human populations. The relatively low genetic diversity observed in contemporary Homo sapiens, particularly when compared to other primate species, suggests that our species passed through a severe population bottleneck sometime between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. The timing of this genetic constriction corresponds closely with the Toba eruption, leading some researchers to propose direct causation between the volcanic catastrophe and near-human extinction. The bottleneck hypothesis gains additional support from the observation that all non-African human populations appear to descend from a relatively small founding group that expanded from Africa sometime after 70,000 years ago. This pattern suggests that earlier human expansions into Asia and the Middle East, documented at sites like Kafsa and Skull, may have been terminated by the Toba catastrophe. The populations that survived would have been primarily African groups that were geographically distant from the eruption center and possibly better adapted to variable environmental conditions. However, archaeological evidence from the Indian subcontinent has begun to challenge the most extreme versions of the Toba catastrophe hypothesis. Excavations at Jwalapuram in the Kurnool district of Andhra Pradesh have revealed stone tool assemblages both below and above the Toba ash layer, suggesting continuity of human occupation through the volcanic crisis. The archaeological sequence at Jwalapuram shows Middle Paleolithic stone tools and deposits immediately underlying the Toba ash, followed by similar tool traditions in the overlying sediments. The Jwalapuram evidence indicates that human populations in India possessed sufficient technological and social capabilities to survive the immediate effects of the Toba eruption. The stone tool assemblages include sophisticated blade technologies and prepared core techniques that demonstrated advanced lithic skills. The similarity between pre- and post-Toba tool traditions suggests that local human populations maintained their cultural knowledge and technical capabilities despite the environmental catastrophe. Additional archaeological sites across India have yielded similar evidence for human survival through the Toba event. Excavations at Dara I Khor in the Middle Sun Valley of northern India have produced stone tool sequences that span the Toba ash horizon, again suggesting population continuity rather than local extinction. These sites preserve evidence of systematic tool production using carefully prepared cores and standardized reduction sequences that indicate sophisticated cultural traditions. The technological capabilities demonstrated at these sites suggest that human populations developed adaptive strategies sufficient to cope with severe environmental stress. The tool assemblages include specialized implements for processing plant materials, indicating that these communities had developed broad-spectrum subsistence strategies that could exploit diverse resource bases. This technological flexibility may have been crucial for survival during the prolonged environmental disruption following the Toba eruption. The survival of human populations in India during the Toba crisis required remarkable adaptations to drastically altered environmental conditions. The volcanic ashfall across the subcontinent reached thicknesses of several centimeters, sufficient to disrupt plant communities and contaminate water sources. The reduction in solar radiation would have severely impacted plant productivity, reducing the availability of both wild plant foods and the herbivore populations that depended on them. Archaeological evidence suggests that surviving human groups adapted through increased mobility and dietary diversification. Sites from this period show evidence for exploitation of underground storage organs, tubers, and roots that would have been less affected by surface ash deposition. The processing tools found at these sites include specialized grinding implements that may have been used to remove volcanic ash from plant materials or to process foods that required extensive preparation to remove toxic compounds. The demographic impact of the Toba eruption extended beyond immediate mortality to include long-term reproductive consequences. Volcanic ash inhalation would have caused severe respiratory problems, particularly affecting children and elderly individuals. The reduction in food availability would have led to malnutrition and increased susceptibility to disease. These factors combined to create sustained population decline that continued for generations after the initial eruption. Despite these challenges, the genetic evidence suggests that some human populations not only survived, but eventually thrived in the post-Toba environment. The mitochondrial DNA lineages that expanded from Africa after 70,000 years ago show patterns consistent with rapid population growth from small founding groups. This demographic expansion indicates that surviving populations possessed adaptive advantages that enabled them to exploit the recovering post-volcanic environment effectively. The recovery patterns following the Toba catastrophe reveal the remarkable resilience of both human populations and natural ecosystems. Climate records from ice cores and marine sediments show that global temperatures began returning to pre-eruption levels within a decade of the event. However, regional recovery varied significantly, with some areas experiencing prolonged disruption, while others rebounded relatively quickly. Vegetation communities across the affected regions showed differential recovery rates, depending on local environmental conditions and the severity of initial damage. Areas that received heavy ashfall experienced delayed ecological recovery, as soils required time to develop sufficient fertility to support plant growth. However, the volcanic ash also provided mineral nutrients that ultimately enhanced soil fertility once the initial toxic effects have been ameliorated through weathering and leaching. The megafauna populations of Asia faced severe challenges during and after the Toba eruption. Large herbivores dependent on extensive grassland and woodland habitats suffered massive mortality as vegetation communities collapsed under the combined effects of ash burial and reduced solar radiation. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of increased human exploitation of stressed animal populations, suggesting that surviving human groups may have benefited temporarily from the availability of weakened prey animals. However, the long-term effects on megafauna populations were severe and persistent. Many large mammal species that had thrived in the pre-Toba environment never fully recovered their previous population levels. The disruption of migration routes and breeding grounds created lasting impacts on species that required large territories and stable environmental conditions. These effects contributed to the broader pattern of megafauna extinction that characterized the later Pleistocene period. The Toba catastrophe also had significant impacts on human technological and cultural evolution. The severe environmental stress may have accelerated the development of more sophisticated technologies and social systems necessary for survival in unpredictable conditions. Archaeological evidence from post-Toba sites shows increased standardization of tool technologies and evidence for long-distance exchange networks that may have developed as adaptive responses to resource scarcity and environmental uncertainty. The social implications of surviving such a catastrophic event likely included increased cooperation between groups and the development of more complex information sharing systems. The knowledge necessary for identifying safe water sources, locating edible plants that were not contaminated with volcanic ash, and predicting weather patterns would have become extremely valuable. Communities that could effectively share and preserve such information would have possessed significant survival advantages. As the immediate effects of the Toba eruption began to subside and global climate systems stabilized, the surviving human populations found themselves in a world that had been fundamentally transformed. The demographic bottleneck created by the volcanic winter had eliminated many local populations and cultural traditions, but had also created opportunities for the survivors to expand into previously occupied territories. The stage was set for the remarkable human expansion that would characterize the following millennia, as small groups of survivors began the process of recolonizing vast areas of Asia and eventually expanding into previously uninhabited continents. The survivors of the Toba catastrophe emerged into a world fundamentally altered by volcanic winter. Yet within several millennia, these resilient populations would accomplish the most remarkable expansion in human history. The demographic bottleneck that had nearly extinguished Homo sapiens created unexpected opportunities for the surviving groups, who found themselves inheriting vast territories previously occupied by populations that had perished during the climatic crisis. These survivors possessed not only the genetic foundation for all future human populations outside Africa, but also the technological sophistication and adaptive flexibility that would enable them to colonize environments no hominin had ever successfully inhabited. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Middle East and South Asia reveals that by 60,000 years ago, human populations had not only recovered from the Toba catastrophe, but had begun developing new migration strategies that would carry them far beyond their ancestral African homeland. The stone tool assemblages from this period demonstrate remarkable technological innovations, including the systematic production of blade tools that were lighter, sharper, and more versatile than earlier technologies. These implements required sophisticated understanding of stone fracture mechanics and represented a significant advance in efficiency of raw material use. The recovery populations showed evidence of enhanced social organization and information sharing networks that may have developed as adaptive responses to the environmental uncertainties of the post-Toba world. Sites from the Levant and Arabian Peninsula preserve evidence of standardized tool production techniques that suggest widespread cultural communication across vast distances. The similarity of lithic technologies found at sites separated by thousands of kilometers indicates either direct population movement or extensive trade and cultural exchange networks that facilitated the rapid spread of technological innovations. The primary route for human expansion out of Africa during this period followed the southern coastal corridor, taking advantage of the dramatically lowered sea levels that characterized the glacial world. As continental ice sheets continued locking up oceanic water, sea levels had dropped more than 60 m below modern levels, exposing vast areas of previously submerged continental shelf. The Red Sea, normally a significant barrier to movement between Africa and Arabia, had narrowed to a strait less than 4 kilometers wide at its southern end, creating a crossing point that required only rudimentary watercraft to navigate. The exposed coastlines of the Arabian Peninsula and Indian Ocean provided a continuous pathway that human populations could follow eastward without encountering the harsh interior deserts that had previously limited movement. These coastal zones retained sufficient moisture from oceanic influences to support woodland and grassland communities that could sustain migrating human groups. Archaeological sites along this route, though many now submerged beneath rising post-glacial seas, preserve evidence of systematic exploitation of both terrestrial and marine resources. The populations following the southern route demonstrated remarkable technological adaptations for coastal environments. Shell middens from sites in Oman and the Persian Gulf region contain evidence of sophisticated marine resource exploitation, including systematic collection of shellfish, capture of nearshore fish species, and possibly even primitive forms of aquaculture. The tool assemblages from these sites include specialized implements for processing marine resources, including shell scrapers and composite fishing equipment that represent significant innovations in subsistence technology. Genetic evidence from modern populations provides crucial insights into the timing and scale of these early migrations. Mitochondrial DNA lineages found in contemporary Asian and Australian populations trace back to founding groups that left Africa between 65,000 and 55,000 years ago. The relatively low genetic diversity within these lineages suggests that the founding populations were quite small, possibly consisting of only a few hundred individuals who successfully established themselves outside Africa and subsequently expanded to populate entire continents. The Y chromosome evidence tells a similar story, with the major haplogroups found in non-African populations deriving from a common ancestor who lived approximately 60,000 years ago. The geographic distribution of these genetic lineages traces the pathways of early human expansion, with the earliest branches found in populations along the proposed southern coastal route through Arabia and South Asia. The genetic data suggests rapid population growth following successful establishment outside Africa. with founding groups expanding exponentially as they encountered virgin territories rich in unexploited resources. The most remarkable achievement of these early migrants was their successful colonization of Australia, which required crossing significant water barriers even during periods of maximum sea level lowering. The journey from the Southeast Asian mainland to Australia involved navigating at least 90 kilometers of open ocean, a distance that required sophisticated watercraft and navigation skills. Archaeological evidence from sites like Majbeeb in northern Australia documents human presence by approximately 65,000 years ago, making this the earliest confirmed evidence of modern human occupation outside the Afro-Eurasian landmass. The watercraft necessary for reaching Australia would have required advanced understanding of marine construction techniques and materials. While no direct archaeological evidence of these early boats has survived, ethnographic studies of traditional watercraft construction in the region provide insights into possible technologies. Bamboo rafts lashed with plant fibers could achieve sufficient size and stability for ocean crossings, while bark canoes sealed with tree resins offered alternative construction methods using readily available materials. The successful crossing required not only appropriate technology, but also sophisticated understanding of ocean currents, wind patterns, and celestial navigation. The human populations that reached Australia encountered a continent populated by megafauna species that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. Giant marsupials, including Diprotodon optatum, weighing over 2,000 kilograms, dominated the herbivore communities across much of the continent. These massive wombat-like creatures, standing 2 m at the shoulder, possessed powerful claws adapted for digging and stripping bark from trees. Their feeding behavior shaped entire ecosystems, creating clearings in dense woodland and maintaining grassland communities through their grazing activities. The Australian megafauna assemblage included predators equally impressive in scale. Megalania prisca, a monitor lizard reaching lengths of 7 m, represented the apex predator in many ecosystems. These massive reptiles possessed venomous saliva and crushing bite forces that enabled them to take down prey as large as Diprotodon. Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, combined the climbing abilities of modern koalas with the predatory adaptations of large cats, using enormous thumb claws to dispatch prey animals in dense woodland environments. The arrival of human populations in Australia coincided with dramatic environmental changes that would ultimately lead to the extinction of most megafauna species. Archaeological sites preserve evidence of human hunting activities targeting large, including butchery sites, where Diprotodon remains show clear evidence of systematic processing. However, the relationship between human arrival and megafauna extinction remains complex, with climate change and habitat modification through human use of fire also contributing to ecosystem transformation. The Aboriginal populations that colonized Australia demonstrated remarkable adaptive capabilities, developing technologies and social systems suited to the continent's diverse environments. The stone tool traditions that developed in Australia show both continuity with earlier Asian technologies and significant innovations adapted to local raw materials and subsistence needs. The extensive use of ground-edge axes, rare in contemporary Asian assemblages, reflects adaptation to the woody plants that dominated many Australian environments. Fire management emerged as a crucial technology for Australian populations, enabling them to modify landscapes on continental scales. The systematic burning practices developed by Aboriginal groups created mosaic patterns of vegetation that increased habitat diversity and promoted the growth of useful plant species. Archaeological evidence suggests that these fire management systems were established within several millennia of initial colonization, indicating rapid development of sophisticated landscape modification techniques. Meanwhile, Across Eurasia, the expanding Homo sapiens populations encountered established Neanderthal communities that had occupied these regions for hundreds of thousands of years. The archaeological record from sites across Europe and Western Asia documents complex interactions between these different human species, ranging from competition for resources to technological exchange and genetic admixture. The Châteauperonian culture of southwestern France and northern Spain represents a particularly intriguing example of possible cultural interaction, with Neanderthal populations adopting blade technologies and symbolic behaviors characteristic of modern human traditions. Recent genetic studies have revealed that interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals occurred multiple times and in multiple locations as the expanding modern human populations encounter Neanderthal groups. The Neanderthal DNA sequences found in contemporary non-African populations, typically comprising 1–3% of individual genomes, derive from admixture events that occurred primarily in the Middle East and Central Asia between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago. These genetic exchanges occurred despite significant biological and cultural differences between the species, suggesting that reproductive barriers were not absolute. The archaeological evidence for Homo sapiens-Neanderthal interactions includes sites where both species' tool technologies appear in the same stratigraphic sequences, indicating either direct contact or rapid succession of occupation. At Arcy-sur-Cure in France, Châteauperonian levels containing Neanderthal remains also preserve blade tools and bone ornaments typically associated with modern human cultures. This technological convergence suggests either independent innovation by Neanderthals or cultural transmission from contemporary Homo sapiens populations. The demographic impact of the Homo sapiens expansion on Neanderthal populations appears to have been severe and ultimately terminal. Radiocarbon dating of late Neanderthal sites across Europe shows a pattern of population contraction and eventual disappearance that correlates with the arrival of modern human populations in each region. The last confirmed Neanderthal sites, located in southern Spain and dating to approximately 40,000 years ago, represent the final refugia of a species that had successfully inhabited Europe for over 400,000 years. The technological innovations that characterized this period of human expansion included the development of sophisticated composite tools that combine multiple materials to achieve enhanced performance. Spear throwers, or atlatls, emerged during this period as mechanical devices that increased the velocity and accuracy of projectile weapons. These implements, carved from wood or antler and precisely balanced to optimize throwing mechanics, represented significant advances in hunting technology that enabled more efficient exploitation of large game animals. The systematic production of bone and antler tools became increasingly common during this period, with archaeological sites preserving evidence of specialized workshops where these materials were processed into finished implements. Bone needles, some with eyes so small they required magnification to thread, demonstrate remarkable precision in manufacturing and suggest the development of sophisticated clothing technologies. The ability to produce fitted garments would have been crucial for survival in the harsh climates that characterize much of Eurasia during this glacial period. Evidence for symbolic behavior and artistic expression becomes increasingly abundant in the archaeological record from this period. The cave paintings at sites like Chauvet in France, dating to approximately 40,000 years ago, represent some of the earliest confirmed examples of representational art in the archaeological record. These sophisticated images, depicting horses, rhinoceros, and other Ice Age animals with remarkable accuracy and artistic skill, indicate the presence of fully modern cognitive capabilities and symbolic communication systems. The production of personal ornaments and decorative objects expanded dramatically during this period, with archaeological sites preserving evidence of bead production, pendant manufacture, and body painting using ochre and other pigments. These symbolic materials often show evidence of long-distance transport, indicating extensive trade networks and cultural communication across vast distances. The standardization of ornament styles across broad geographic regions suggests the emergence of shared cultural identities and possibly complex social hierarchies. Musical instruments from this period include bone flutes, with precisely drilled finger holes that demonstrate understanding of acoustic principles and mathematical relationships between tone production and hole spacing. The Hohlfels flute from Germany, dating to approximately 40,000 years ago, represents one of the earliest confirmed musical instruments and suggests that complex cultural expressions were well-established components of human society by this time. The settlement patterns that emerged during this period of expansion show evidence of increasing social complexity and territorial organization. Base camps with evidence of long-term occupation appear alongside networks of smaller sites that suggest seasonal mobility patterns adapted to resource availability. The distribution of these sites indicates sophisticated understanding of landscape ecology and resource scheduling that enabled human populations to exploit diverse environments efficiently. Storage technologies became increasingly sophisticated during this period with archaeological evidence for constructed storage facilities and food processing installations that enabled populations to buffer against seasonal resource scarcity. The development of effective storage systems was crucial for survival in high-latitude environments where resource availability showed extreme seasonal variation. Sites from this period preserve evidence of systematic food processing activities, including the production of dried meat, processed plant foods, and possibly fermented beverages. By 26,500 years ago, the gradual accumulation of ice that had characterized the preceding millennia reached its ultimate expression. The continental ice sheets of North America and Northern Europe had grown to dimensions that dwarfed anything witnessed by human civilization. The Laurentide ice sheet stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, covering virtually all of present-day Canada and extending deep into what would become the northern United States. At its thickest point over Hudson Bay, this massive ice dome reached elevations exceeding 3,000 m above sea level, creating an ice mass so heavy that it depressed the underlying bedrock by several hundred meters. The sheer scale of these ice accumulations defied comprehension. The Laurentide ice sheet alone contained approximately 26.5 million cubic kilometers of ice, representing roughly 13 times the volume of all present-day ice sheets combined. The ice front extended southward to modern-day New York City, covering the sites of future Great Lakes under kilometers of glacial ice. West of the Great Lakes region, the ice margin swept southward through Minnesota and the Dakotas, reaching its maximum southern extent in Kansas and Missouri. This southern boundary represented the equilibrium point where annual ice accumulation balanced summer melting, creating a dynamic but relatively stable ice margin. Across the Atlantic, the Fennoscandian ice sheet had expanded to cover all of Scandinavia, extending across the Baltic Sea to encompass much of northern Russia and reaching southward into Germany and Poland. The ice dome centered over the Gulf of Bothnia achieved thicknesses comparable to those of the Laurentide sheet, with ice extending westward to cover the British Isles under a continuous glacial mass. The weight of this accumulated ice was so immense that Scandinavia continues to rebound upward today, rising at rates of several millimeters per year as the Earth's crust slowly adjusts to the removal of this ancient burden. The global impact of these continental ice sheets extended far beyond their immediate margins through their effect on sea level. With approximately 52 million cubic kilometers of water locked in terrestrial ice, global sea levels had dropped to 120 m below present levels. This dramatic reduction exposed vast areas of continental shelf that had been submerged for tens of thousands of years. The English Channel had become a broad river valley with the Thames and Rhine systems merging into a single drainage network that flowed northward across the exposed Doggerland Plain. This emergent landscape stretched from eastern England to the Netherlands and beyond, creating a landmass larger than modern-day Britain. The Bering Land Bridge had expanded to its maximum extent, creating a subcontinental landmass nearly 2,000 kilometers wide that connected Asia and North America. This exposed terrain, technically part of the Beringian refugium, supported extensive grassland ecosystems that harbored some of the highest concentrations of large mammals in Earth's history. The continental shelves surrounding Southeast Asia had emerged as vast lowland plains connecting the modern Indonesian archipelago into a single landmass called Sundaland that stretched from the Malay Peninsula to Java and Borneo. The atmospheric circulation patterns of the last glacial maximum bore little resemblance to modern weather systems. The massive ice sheets created their own weather-generating high-pressure systems that dominated regional climate patterns across much of the northern hemisphere. Cold, dry air masses flowed outward from the ice sheet centers, creating persistent anticyclonic conditions that brought clear skies but frigid temperatures to vast areas. The jet stream, displaced southward by the presence of the ice sheets, followed a more meridional path that brought Arctic air deep into temperate latitudes while simultaneously drawing warm, moist air northward along the ice sheet margins. Global average temperatures during the last glacial maximum were approximately 4 to 7 degrees Celsius colder than modern conditions, but regional variations were far more extreme. Areas immediately adjacent to ice sheet margins experienced temperature deviations of 15 to 20 degrees Celsius below present values, creating climatic conditions more severe than those found in modern Antarctica. The continental interiors of North America and Eurasia, isolated from oceanic moderating influences by vast distances and ice barriers, experienced winter temperatures that regularly dropped below 50 degrees Celsius across areas larger than modern countries. Precipitation patterns showed dramatic alterations from modern distributions. The ice sheets themselves created arid conditions across their surfaces and immediate peripheries, as the cold air masses flowing off the ice had little capacity to hold moisture. However, the margins of the ice sheets where warmer air masses encountered the glacial boundaries became zones of intense precipitation that fed continued ice accumulation. These marginal zones experienced heavy snowfall that could exceed several meters annually, creating the conditions necessary for sustained ice sheet growth. The tropical regions, while significantly cooler than modern conditions, maintained sufficient warmth to support forest ecosystems, though these were dramatically different in composition from contemporary tropical forests. The Amazon rainforest contracted to isolated refugia in the wettest areas, while much of the basin supported savanna and grassland communities adapted to cooler and drier conditions. Africa experienced severe aridification, with the Sahara expanding far beyond its modern boundaries and the tropical forests of Central Africa retreating to small refugial areas along major river systems. In this harsh glacial world, human populations had contracted to a few favorable refugia where climatic conditions remained tolerable and resources sufficient to support viable communities. The most significant of these refugia lay in southwestern Europe, in the region encompassing the Pyrenees, the Cantabrian Mountains, and southwestern France. This Franco-Cantabrian refugium benefited from its position between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea, which provided moderating oceanic influences that prevented the extreme continental cooling experienced in other regions. Archaeological sites throughout the Franco-Cantabrian refugium preserve evidence of remarkably sophisticated human cultures that developed during the last glacial maximum. The Magdalenian culture, which emerged around 17,000 years ago, represents one of the most technologically advanced hunter-gatherer societies in the archaeological record. These populations developed specialized tool technologies that enabled efficient exploitation of the abundant reindeer herds that migrated through the region. Their lithic assemblages included precisely manufactured microliths that were hafted into composite tools, creating implements that combined maximum cutting efficiency with minimal raw material consumption. The artistic achievements of these refugial populations surpassed anything previously seen in the archaeological record. The cave paintings at Lascaux, Altamira, and dozens of other sites represent sophisticated artistic traditions that combine naturalistic representation with symbolic communication systems. These images, created using carefully prepared pigments and sophisticated painting techniques, demonstrate detailed knowledge of animal anatomy and behavior that could only have been acquired through intensive observation and cultural transmission of knowledge across generations. The Magdalenian populations also developed remarkable technologies for working bone, antler, and ivory into sophisticated tools and artistic objects. Their workshops produced barb harpoons with multiple rows of backward angle points that enabled efficient fishing in the salmon runs that provided crucial seasonal resources. Spear throwers carved from antler and decorated with artistic motifs increased hunting efficiency while serving as markers of individual or group identity. Bone needles with eyes so precisely drilled they required modern magnification to appreciate enabled the production of fitted clothing essential for survival in glacial conditions. Settlement patterns in the Franco-Cantabrian refugium show evidence of complex social organization and territorial systems. Large base camps located in cave systems provided winter shelter for extended communities. On networks of smaller sites, enabled exploitation of seasonal resources across the landscape. The distribution of these sites suggests sophisticated understanding of animal migration patterns and resource scheduling that enabled human populations to maintain stable communities despite the challenging environmental conditions. Further east, human populations survived in refugia scattered across southern Siberia and Central Asia. The Malta-Buret culture, centered in the Lake Baikal region, developed distinctive technologies adapted to the extreme continental conditions of interior Asia. These populations created sophisticated winter dwellings using mammoth bones as structural frameworks covered with hides and earth. The thermal efficiency of these structures, revealed through experimental archaeology, enabled human survival in regions where winter temperatures dropped below 40 degrees Celsius for months at a time. The Malta-Buret populations developed specialized hunting technologies for exploiting the mammoth herds that dominated the landscape. Their tool assemblages included massive spear points designed for penetrating the thick hides of megafauna, along with sophisticated processing tools for extracting maximum nutrition from large carcasses. The systematic exploitation of mammoth resources enabled these communities to maintain stable populations in environments that would challenge modern technology. Artistic traditions in the Siberian refugia included remarkable ivory carvings that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human and animal anatomy. The Venus figurines from Malta, carved from mammoth ivory with extraordinary attention to detail, represent some of the earliest examples of three-dimensional representational art. These objects, along with decorated tools and ornaments, indicate complex symbolic systems and possibly religious or ceremonial practices that help maintain social cohesion in isolated communities. The Beringian refugium, encompassing eastern Siberia, Alaska, and the exposed Bering Land Bridge, supported human populations that would eventually become the ancestors of Native American peoples. This region, despite its high latitude, remained largely ice-free due to the continental climate that limited snowfall accumulation. The Beringian populations developed technology specifically adapted to hunting the diverse megafauna assemblages that thrived in the mammoth steppe ecosystem. Archaeological sites in Beringia preserve evidence of sophisticated bone and antler working technologies that enabled efficient exploitation of large mammals. The Bluefish Caves in the northern Yukon contain tool assemblages that demonstrate systematic processing of mammoth, horse, and bison remains. These populations developed specialized techniques for preserving meat and other organic materials through the long Arctic winters, creating food storage systems that enabled year-round occupation of high-latitude environments. The megafauna communities of the last glacial maximum represented the culmination of Pleistocene evolutionary adaptations to cold climate conditions. Woolly mammoths had reached their maximum geographic distribution, with populations extending from Western Europe to Eastern North America. These magnificent elephantids had evolved sophisticated behavioral adaptations for surviving in glacial environments, including complex social structures that enabled cooperative foraging and protection of young animals during harsh winter conditions. Individual mammoths during the last glacial maximum achieved remarkable sizes, with adult males reaching shoulder heights of 3.5 m and weights exceeding 6,000 kilograms. Their curved tusks, reaching lengths of 4 m in exceptional specimens, served multiple functions, including snow removal, bark stripping, and intraspecific combat. The dense wool undercoat that covered their bodies consisted of fine fibers measuring only 10-15 micrometers in diameter, providing insulation comparable to the finest modern synthetic materials. Mammoth herds modified entire landscapes through their feeding activities and migration patterns. A typical herd of 50-100 individuals could consume 15,000-30,000 kilograms of vegetation daily, requiring constant movement to avoid overgrazing any particular area. Their massive feet, measuring over 40 centimeters in diameter, compacted snow and created pathways that other animals followed. During summer months, mammoth herds migrated hundreds of kilometers following the growth of nutritious grasses and herbs, creating well-established routes that persisted for millennia. Woolly rhinoceros shared the mammoth steppe with their elephanted companions, though their feeding strategies focused more heavily on woody browse and coarser vegetation. These massive ungulates, weighing up to 3,000 kilograms, possess flattened horns adapted for sweeping snow away from buried vegetation. Their broad, flat feet distributed weight effectively across soft ground, while their dense coat provided insulation against temperatures that regularly dropped below 30 degrees Celsius. The presence of both mammoth and rhinoceros in the same habitats indicates extraordinary productivity in these ancient grassland systems. Cave lions had achieved their maximum size and distribution during the last glacial maximum, with populations extending across Eurasia from Spain to Alaska. These powerful predators, 25% larger than modern African lions, possessed robust builds adapted for hunting megafauna prey in open environments. Their hunting strategies likely involve cooperative attacks on young or weakened mammoths and rhinoceros, though they also hunted smaller prey, including reindeer, horses, and bison. The cave lion populations of this period showed remarkable adaptations to cold conditions, including dense winter coats and behavioral modifications for hunting in snow-covered landscapes. Cave bears had reached the peak of their evolutionary success, occupying extensive cave systems throughout Europe and Asia. These massive ursids, with skulls exceeding 75 centimeters in length, had evolved specialized dentition for processing plant materials, though they retained the physical capabilities for occasional carnivory. Their cave systems often provided evidence of complex relationships with human populations, as both species sought the same sheltered locations for winter survival. The competition for cave resources may have contributed to the eventual extinction of cave bears as human populations expanded and developed more sophisticated technologies. Extreme conditions of the last glacial maximum had pushed human ingenuity to unprecedented heights. as ice sheets reached their maximum extent and global temperatures plummeted to their lowest levels in over 100,000 years. Surviving populations developed technological innovations that would fundamentally transform human capabilities and lay the foundation for all subsequent cultural evolution. The scattered refugial communities, isolated by vast expanses of ice and tundra, independently developed sophisticated solutions to the challenges of survival in one of Earth's most hostile climatic periods. The most revolutionary advancement emerged in projectile technology, where human populations developed the otlotl or spear thrower, a mechanical device that dramatically increased both the velocity and accuracy of hunting weapons. These implements, typically carved from wood, bone, or antler, functioned as extensions of the human arm, utilizing leverage principles to multiply throwing force. Archaeological specimens from Magdalenian sites in southwestern France demonstrate remarkable engineering sophistication with precisely calculated weight distributions and grip configurations that maximize throwing efficiency. The most elaborate examples, such as those recovered from La Madeleine's site, featured carved decorations and carefully balanced counterweights that enhanced both functional performance and symbolic significance. The physics of otlotl operation required intimate understanding of biomechanics and projectile dynamics. The device effectively doubled the length of the thrower's arm, increasing angular velocity and imparting significantly greater kinetic energy to the projectile. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that skilled otlotl users could achieve projectile velocities exceeding 45 meters per second, nearly double the speed attainable through hand throwing alone. This velocity increase translated directly into enhanced penetrating power and effective hunting range, enabling human hunters to take down large game animals from safer distances. Complementing the mechanical advantages of spear throwers, human populations developed increasingly sophisticated projectile points specifically designed for different hunting scenarios and prey species. The Solutrean culture of southwestern Europe, flourishing between 22,000 and 17,000 years ago, produced some of the most technically advanced stone points in the archaeological record. These laurel leaf points, characterized by their symmetrical biface construction and extremely thin cross sections, required extraordinary knapping skills to manufacture. The production process involved pressure flaking techniques that remove flakes less than a millimeter thick, creating cutting edges sharper than modern steel. Different point styles reflected specialized hunting strategies adapted to specific prey animals and environmental conditions. Broad-bladed points designed for hunting mammoth and other megafauna featured robust construction capable of penetrating thick hides and maintaining structural integrity during impact with massive bones. Narrow, elongated points optimized for hunting reindeer and other medium-sized game emphasized penetration depth and reduced air resistance for improved accuracy over longer distances. Barbed points, often carved from bone or antler, incorporated backward angle projections that prevented prey animals from dislodging embedded projectiles, ensuring that wounded animals could be tracked and recovered. The development of composite projectile technology represented another crucial innovation. These sophisticated weapons incorporated multiple materials to optimize performance characteristics impossible to achieve with single material construction. Stone points provided sharp cutting edges and penetrating power, while wooden shafts offered flexibility and reduced weight. Sinew bindings and organic adhesives, often derived from pine pitch or birch tar, created secure attachments that could withstand the tremendous forces generated during high-velocity impacts. Some composite points incorporated bone or antler foreshafts that absorbed impact energy and prevented damage to the valuable stone points during encounters with hard materials. Communal hunting strategies evolved to exploit the massive herds of reindeer, horses, and other gregarious species that dominated glacial landscapes. Archaeological sites throughout Europe preserve evidence of sophisticated drive systems where human groups coordinated their activities to channel entire herds toward natural or constructed killing grounds. The Stellmore site in northern Germany reveals evidence of systematic reindeer hunting operations that involve dozens of participants working together to exploit seasonal migrations. Wooden posts and brush barriers directed animals toward narrow valleys or lake margins where waiting hunters could dispatch large numbers with minimal risk. These communal hunts required complex social coordination and information sharing systems that extended far beyond immediate family groups. The timing of reindeer migrations varied annually based on weather conditions and forage availability, necessitating communication networks that could rapidly disseminate information across wide geographic areas. Archaeological evidence suggests that successful hunting groups maintained alliances with neighboring communities, sharing both hunting territories and crucial ecological knowledge that enabled accurate prediction of animal movements. The scale of some communal hunting operations bordered on industrial efficiency. Mass killing sites, like Sauter in France, contain remains of tens of thousands of horses accumulated over centuries of repeated hunting activities. The systematic processing of such enormous quantities of meat required sophisticated butchery techniques and preservation technologies. Archaeological analysis reveals standardized dismemberment sequences that maximize meat recovery while minimizing processing time. Specific tool types emerge for different stages of carcass processing, from initial skinning through final bone marrow extraction. Shelter construction during this period achieved remarkable sophistication, particularly in regions where natural caves were unavailable and traditional building materials scarce. The mammoth bone houses of the Eastern European plain represent some of the most impressive architectural achievements of hunter-gatherer societies. These structures, found at sites like Mezhyrich and Kostenki in Ukraine, utilize the massive bones of woolly mammoths as primary structural elements in carefully engineered designs that could withstand extreme weather conditions. The construction process for mammoth bone dwellings required careful selection and preparation of appropriate skeletal elements. Mammoth skulls, weighing up to 100 kilograms each, form foundation elements that distributed structural loads across frozen ground. Long bones, including femurs and humeri exceeding 1.5 m in length, served as vertical supports and roof beams. Curved tusks, some reaching 4 m in length, were interwoven to create dome-shaped frameworks that could support heavy covering materials while shedding wind and snow loads effectively. Archaeological reconstruction of these dwellings reveals sophisticated understanding of structural engineering principles. The circular or oval floor plans, typically measuring 4-6 m in diameter, optimized interior space while minimizing heat loss through reduced surface area to volume ratios. Multiple hearths positioned strategically throughout the interior provided heating zones that created comfortable microclimates even when exterior temperatures dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Smoke holes incorporated wind deflectors that prevented downdrafts while maintaining adequate ventilation for fire safety. The covering systems for mammoth bone houses combined multiple materials in layered arrangements that provided exceptional insulation. Animal hides, primarily from mammoth, rhinoceros, and reindeer, formed the primary weatherproof barrier. These skins were carefully prepared using specialized tanning techniques that maintain flexibility in extreme cold while providing water resistance. Beneath the hide layer, thick accumulations of grass, moss, and other organic materials created insulating air spaces that dramatically reduced heat loss. Some structures incorporated additional outer layers of earth and stones that provided thermal mass and wind protection. Interior organization of these dwellings reflected sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics and space utilization. Sleeping areas were typically elevated on platforms constructed from flat bones and covered with thick fur bedding that provided insulation from ground cold. Storage areas for food, tools, and raw materials were positioned in cooler zones near the walls, taking advantage of natural refrigeration to preserve perishable materials. Work areas around central hearths provided adequate lighting and warmth for tool manufacture and food preparation activities. The social implications of mammoth bone house construction extended far beyond simple shelter provision. These structures required coordinated labor from multiple individuals over extended periods, necessitating complex social agreements about resource sharing and construction responsibilities. The enormous quantities of mammoth bones needed for a single dwelling could only be accumulated through systematic hunting or scavenging operations that involved entire communities. The investment of time and materials in permanent structures also indicated reduced mobility and increased territorial attachment that represented significant shifts in hunter-gatherer social organization. Trade networks during this period achieved unprecedented geographic scope and organizational complexity, connecting communities separated by thousands of kilometers through systematic exchange of raw materials, finished goods, and cultural information. Archaeological evidence reveals movement of exotic materials across distances that would challenge modern transportation systems. Baltic amber appeared in archaeological sites throughout Central and Southern Europe, indicating trade routes that spanned over 1,500 kilometers. Mediterranean shells reached sites in northern France and Germany, demonstrating north-south trade connections that crossed major geographic barriers. The most remarkable evidence for long-distance trade involves the distribution of high-quality lithic raw materials. Flint from specific quarry sources in Poland appears in tool assemblages throughout Central Europe, sometimes at distances exceeding 800 kilometers from source locations. The distinctive characteristics of different flint varieties enable archaeologists to trace specific trade routes and identify exchange networks that operated with remarkable consistency over millennia. Some exotic raw materials appear to have moved through multiple intermediate exchanges, suggesting complex multi-step trade relationships rather than direct long-distance transport. Obsidian trade networks in southeastern Europe demonstrate even more sophisticated exchange systems. This volcanic glass, prized for its exceptional sharpness and workability, originated from sources in the Carpathian Mountains and Anatolia, but appears in archaeological sites throughout the Balkans and Eastern Mediterranean. The distances involved, often exceeding 1,000 kilometers, required organized transport systems and established trade relationships that could guarantee reliable access to these valuable materials. The standardization of obsidian blade production techniques across wide geographic areas suggests not only material exchange, but also transfer of technical knowledge and manufacturing traditions. Symbolic objects and personal ornaments provide crucial evidence for the cultural dimensions of these trade networks. Perforated animal teeth, carved ivory pendants, and decorated bone objects appear in similar forms across vast geographic regions, indicating shared symbolic systems and cultural communication that transcended local group boundaries. The Venus figurines found throughout Europe, from Spain to Siberia, demonstrate remarkable stylistic consistency that suggests either direct cultural contact or systematic transmission of artistic traditions across continental distances. The production and exchange of these symbolic objects required specialized craft knowledge and dedicated manufacturing time that went far beyond immediate subsistence needs. Ivory carving, in particular, demanded sophisticated tools and techniques that could only be developed through extensive practice and cultural transmission. The most elaborate examples, such as the Venus of Brassampui with its intricately carved facial features, demonstrate artistic skills comparable to those of professional sculptors. The investment of time and valuable raw materials in purely symbolic objects indicates the crucial importance of cultural expression and social identity in Ice Age communities. Artistic achievements during this period reached unprecedented levels of sophistication and geographic distribution. The cave paintings at Lascaux, created approximately 17,000 years ago, represent one of humanity's greatest artistic accomplishments. The main chamber, known as the Hall of Bulls, contains over 600 painted animals rendered with extraordinary accuracy and artistic skill. The largest bull figures, measuring over 5 m in length, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of perspective and proportion that would not be equaled in European art for thousands of years. The technical aspects of cave painting required extensive preparation and specialized knowledge of pigment chemistry. Artists ground mineral ochres, iron oxides, and manganese compounds into fine powders that were mixed with animal fats, plant juices, and other binding agents to create durable paints. The application techniques included finger painting, brushwork using animal hair implements, and spray painting achieved by blowing pigment through hollow bones or reed tubes. The sophisticated shading and highlighting effects visible in the best examples required understanding of light sources and color theory that indicates highly developed artistic traditions. The positioning of paintings within cave systems reveals sophisticated understanding of architectural space and viewing perspectives. Artists carefully selected wall surfaces that enhanced the three-dimensional effects of their work, utilizing natural rock contours to suggest animal musculature and movement. The famous horse panels at Lascaux incorporate natural rock projections to create the illusion of rounded bodies, while the positioning of figures takes advantage of optimal viewing angles that maximize dramatic impact. Some paintings were positioned in extremely difficult locations that required scaffolding or other construction techniques to access, indicating the crucial importance placed on artistic expression. Altamira Cave in northern Spain contains equally impressive artistic achievements that demonstrate the widespread distribution of sophisticated painting traditions. The polychrome ceiling, featuring life-sized bison rendered in multiple colors with extraordinary attention to anatomical detail, represents the pinnacle of Paleolithic artistic achievement. The artists utilized natural rock formations to enhance three-dimensional effects, creating images that seem to move in flickering firelight. The technical sophistication evident in color mixing, perspective rendering, and anatomical accuracy indicates artistic traditions that were passed down through generations of specialized practitioners. The subjects chosen for cave paintings provide crucial insights into the spiritual and cultural concerns of Ice Age populations. Large herbivores, particularly horses, bison, and deer, dominate most assemblages, suggesting these animals held special significance beyond their role as food sources. Predators, including lions and bears, appear less frequently, but often in prominent positions that suggest symbolic importance. The rare human figures that appear in cave art are typically stylized or abstract, contrasting sharply with the naturalistic rendering of animals. Venus figurines represent another distinctive artistic tradition that spanned the entire European continent during the last glacial maximum. These small sculptures, typically carved from ivory, stone, or fired clay, share common stylistic elements despite being produced across vast geographic distances and time spans. The figurines characteristically emphasize female reproductive features while minimizing facial details and extremities, suggesting symbolic rather than portraiture functions. The geographic distribution of Venus figurines, from the Atlantic coast to Siberia, indicates shared cultural concepts and possibly religious beliefs that transcended local group boundaries. Burial practices during this period provide compelling evidence for complex spiritual beliefs and social hierarchies that have developed within hunter-gatherer communities. The elaborate burials at Sungur in Russia, dating to approximately 30,000 years ago, represent some of the most spectacular mortuary displays in the archaeological record. The central burial contained an adult male interred with over 3,000 ivory beads, numerous carved ornaments, and ivory spears that would have required thousands of hours to manufacture. The investment of such valuable materials and labor in mortuary contexts indicates belief systems that extended beyond immediate material concerns. The positioning of bodies in these elaborate burials often followed specific orientations and arrangements that suggest standardized mortuary rituals. Many individuals were buried in extended positions with heads oriented towards specific cardinal directions, while others were placed in flex positions that may have symbolized return to the womb or fetal state. Grave goods were typically arranged in systematic patterns around the body, with weapons near the hands, ornaments positioned on specific body parts, and tools placed in locations that suggest continued use in afterlife contexts. The magnificent ice sheets that had dominated the northern hemisphere for millennia were about to enter a period of unprecedented instability. While human populations in their scattered refugia continued perfecting their survival technologies and artistic traditions, massive forces were building within the continental ice masses that would trigger some of the most dramatic climate oscillations in Earth's history. The Laurentide ice sheet, which had grown steadily for over 100,000 years, was beginning to show signs of internal stress as its enormous weight and accumulated thickness created conditions that would lead to catastrophic ice discharges into the North Atlantic. The first Heinrich event occurred approximately 17,000 years ago when vast sections of the Laurentide ice sheet's eastern margin began collapsing into the Atlantic Ocean. These events, named after German marine geologist Hartmut Heinrich, who first identified them in deep-sea sediment cores, represented some of the most massive ice discharges in geological history. During a typical Heinrich event, enormous icebergs carved from the ice sheet margins at rates that dwarfed anything witnessed in modern times. The icebergs, some measuring several kilometers in length and containing millions of tons of ice, drifted eastward across the North Atlantic, carrying with them vast quantities of rock debris that had been scraped from the North American continent. The scale of these ice discharges defied comprehension. During Heinrich Event 1, which occurred around 16,800 years ago, marine geologists estimate that ice equivalent to the entire modern Greenland ice sheet was discharged into the Atlantic within a few centuries. The icebergs formed massive flotillas that covered thousands of square kilometers of ocean surface, creating a frozen landscape that extended from the Labrador coast to the mid-Atlantic ridge. As these ice masses slowly melted, they released enormous quantities of fresh water into the ocean while simultaneously dropping their cargo of continental debris onto the seafloor. The rock fragments carried by Heinrich icebergs provide a geological fingerprint that allows scientists to trace their origins with remarkable precision. Limestone fragments, characteristic of Hudson Bay geology, appear in deep-sea sediments off the coast of Portugal, indicating that icebergs traveled over 4,000 kilometers before finally melting. Red sandstone from the Canadian Maritimes reach locations off the coast of Ireland, while granite fragments from the Canadian Shield created distinctive sediment layers across vast areas of the North Atlantic seafloor. These debris trails, visible in marine sediment cores, map the pathways of ice discharge and reveal the enormous geographic scope of Heinrich events. The fresh water released during these ice discharges had profound effects on Atlantic Ocean circulation patterns. The North Atlantic's thermohaline circulation, which depends on the formation of dense salty water masses in the Nordic seas, was severely disrupted when massive quantities of fresh water reduced surface salinity across the region. The diluted surface waters became too buoyant to sink and form deep water masses, effectively shutting down the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation that normally transported warm tropical waters northward toward Europe. This circulation collapse triggered rapid cooling across the North Atlantic region within decades of the initial ice discharge. Ocean surface temperatures dropped by 5 to 10 degrees Celsius across vast areas, while the reduced northward heat transport caused dramatic cooling across northwestern Europe. The Gulf Stream, weakened by the disrupted circulation patterns, shifted southward and delivered less warm water to European coastal regions. These changes created feedback loops that amplified the cooling effects as increased sea ice formation reflected more solar radiation back to space and further reduced regional temperatures. The atmospheric consequences of Heinrich events extended far beyond the immediate North Atlantic region. The massive ice-covered ocean surfaces altered wind patterns and storm tracks across the entire northern hemisphere. The jet stream, influenced by the changed temperature gradients, shifted to more meridional patterns that brought Arctic air masses deep into temperate latitudes. These atmospheric reorganizations affected precipitation patterns across Europe, Asia, and North America, creating drought conditions in some regions while triggering increased snowfall in others. Evidence for Heinrich event impact appears in geological records from around the world. Lake sediment cores from Germany show abrupt changes in vegetation composition that indicate rapid cooling and increased aridity during Heinrich events. Stalagmite records from Chinese caves reveal disrupted monsoon patterns that has affected precipitation across vast areas of Asia. Even tropical regions experienced significant changes, with marine sediment cores from the Caribbean showing evidence of altered ocean temperatures and circulation patterns during North Atlantic ice discharge events. The timing of Heinrich events followed a quasi-periodic pattern that suggests they were triggered by internal ice sheet dynamics rather than external climate forcing. The events occurred roughly every 7,000 to 10,000 years during the glacial period, indicating that ice sheet instability developed gradually as the continental ice masses reached critical freshnesses and configurations. Computer models of ice sheet behavior suggest that Heinrich events resulted from the buildup of unstable ice domes that eventually collapsed under their own weight, triggering massive surges of ice toward the ocean margins. The mechanism driving these ice surges involved complex interactions between ice sheet thickness, basal conditions, and ice flow dynamics. As the Laurentide ice sheet grew thicker over Hudson Bay, the enormous weight compressed the underlying bedrock and created basal conditions that promoted rapid ice flow. When ice thickness reached critical values, the increased pressure at the base caused widespread basal melting that lubricated the ice-bedrock interface. This lubrication enabled vast sections of the ice sheet to accelerate rapidly toward the Atlantic margin, creating the massive ice streams that generated Heinrich icebergs. The Hudson Strait, which connected Hudson Bay to the Atlantic Ocean, served as the primary conduit for Heinrich ice discharges. This natural valley, carved by previous glaciations, provided a pathway for ice streams flowing from the interior of the ice sheet toward the ocean. During Heinrich events, ice velocities in Hudson Strait increased from typical values of several meters per year to rates exceeding 1,000 meters per year. This dramatic acceleration created ice streams transported enormous volumes of ice from the interior of the continent to the Atlantic margin within decades. The collapse of these ice streams had cascading effects on the entire Laurentide ice sheet. As vast quantities of ice were rapidly removed from the Hudson Bay region, the ice sheet's profile became unstable, triggering additional ice flow acceleration and further ice loss. This positive feedback process continued until the ice sheet reached a new equilibrium configuration with reduced thickness and extent. The total ice loss during major Heinrich events was sufficient to raise global sea level by several meters, though much of this rise was temporary as ice sheets subsequently regrew during the following millennia. Between Heinrich events, the climate system experienced periods of relative stability punctuated by smaller scale oscillations that reflected the complex interactions between ice sheets, oceans, and atmosphere. Dansgaard-Oeschger cycles, identified in Greenland ice cores, showed rapid temperature fluctuations that occurred every 1,000–3,000 years throughout the glacial period. These cycles typically began with abrupt warming events that raised Greenland temperatures by 5 to 15 degrees Celsius, within followed by gradual cooling that returned conditions to glacial norms over several centuries. The warming phases of Dansgaard-Oeschger cycles, known as interstadials, created brief windows of improved climatic conditions across the North Atlantic region. During these periods, ice sheet margins retreated slightly, vegetation communities expanded northward, and human populations could exploit previously inaccessible territories. Archaeological evidence suggests that these interstadial periods provided crucial opportunities for population expansion and cultural exchange between previously isolated communities. The most significant warming event of this period began around 14,700 years ago and marked the onset of the Balling-Allerod interstadial, a prolonged warming phase that provided temporary relief from full glacial conditions. This warming event, more sustained and intense than previous interstadials, raised temperatures across the North Atlantic region by 7 to 12 degrees Celsius within a few decades. The rapidity of this climate change was extraordinary even by Ice Age standards, with Greenland ice cores showing temperature increases that occurred faster than modern instrumental records can resolve. The Balling-Allerod warming was triggered by a resumption of Atlantic meridional overturning circulation following the end of Heinrich Event 1. As the massive quantities of fresh water from the ice discharge were gradually mixed into the deep ocean, surface salinity in the North Atlantic returned to levels that could support deep water formation. The renewed circulation transported warm tropical waters northward, rapidly warming the North Atlantic and triggering widespread ice sheet retreat across the region. The effects of Balling-Allerod warming extended far beyond simple temperature increases. The strengthened Atlantic circulation altered atmospheric circulation patterns, bringing increased precipitation to previously arid regions while reducing moisture delivery to others. The monsoon systems of Africa and Asia strengthened significantly, bringing life-sustaining rains to regions that had experienced severe drought during the full glacial period. Lake levels rose across the Sahel, while increased vegetation growth created corridors of habitable landscape that connected previously isolated refugial populations. European vegetation communities responded rapidly to the Balling-Allerod warming. Pollen records from lake sediments show dramatic increases in tree species that had survived the glacial period in small refugial populations. Birch and pine forests expanded rapidly northward from their southern refugia, colonizing vast areas that had been tundra or ice covered for millennia. The tree line advanced several hundred kilometers northward within centuries, creating new woodland ecosystems that could support different animal communities and human populations. The partial retreat of ice sheets during the Balling-Allerod period opened new territories for human recolonization. The Fennoscandian ice sheet retreated from its maximum extent, exposing areas of southern Scandinavia that had been ice-covered for tens of thousands of years. These newly available territories, while initially barren and rocky, gradually developed soil communities and vegetation that could support human settlement. Archaeological evidence from sites like Brome, Denmark, documents the rapid colonization of these deglaciated areas by human populations equipped with specialized technologies for exploiting newly available resources. The recolonization process required significant technological and cultural adaptations. The newly exposed landscapes lacked the established ecosystems and predictable resource bases that characterized the traditional refugial areas. Pioneer human populations needed to develop new hunting strategies, identify edible plant species, locate suitable raw materials for tool production, and establish territorial systems in unfamiliar environments. The success of these colonization efforts demonstrates remarkable adaptive flexibility and cultural innovation capabilities. The Hamburgian culture, which emerged in northern Europe around 14,000 years ago, represents one of the most successful early recolonization efforts. These populations developed specialized technologies for hunting reindeer in the newly available tundra environments of northern Germany and southern Scandinavia. Their tool assemblages included distinctive shouldered points designed for hafting on arrows or light spears, indicating the development of more sophisticated projectile technologies adapted to hunting in open landscapes. The geographic distribution of Hamburgian sites traces the northward expansion of human populations following the retreating ice margins. Simultaneously, human populations in eastern Siberia were expanding into previously glaciated territories of Alaska and northwestern North America. The Beringian land bridge, still exposed due to low sea levels, provided a continuous pathway for population movement between Asia and North America. Archaeological sites like Bluefish Caves in the Yukon Territory preserve evidence of human occupation during this period, with tool assemblages that show technological continuity with Siberian traditions, while also displaying adaptations to North American environments and resources. The expansion into North America represented one of the most significant human migrations in prehistory. The populations that crossed Beringia encountered a continent populated by megafauna assemblages that had evolved in isolation from human predation for millions of years. Massive herbivores, including American mastodons, giant ground sloths, and enormous bison species, dominated ecosystems across much of the continent. These animals, lacking behavioral adaptations for avoiding human hunters, were extremely vulnerable to exploitation by technologically sophisticated human populations. The impact of human arrival on North American megafauna was swift and devastating. Archaeological sites throughout the continent preserve evidence of human hunting activities targeting large animals, with kill sites showing systematic butchery of mammoth, mastodon, and giant bison. The Clovis culture, which appeared across North America around 13,500 years ago, developed highly effective hunting technologies specifically adapted for taking down megafauna. Their distinctive fluted projectile points, manufactured using sophisticated pressure flaking techniques, provided the penetrating power necessary for hunting the largest animals on the continent. The megafauna extinctions that began during this period represented one of the most severe biodiversity crises in recent geological history. Within approximately 2,000 years of human arrival, over 70% of North American large mammal species had disappeared forever. Woolly mammoths, which had thrived across the continent for hundreds of thousands of years, survived only in isolated populations on Arctic islands. Giant ground sloths, some weighing over 3,000 kilograms, vanished from landscapes they had dominated for millions of years. American cheetahs, short-faced bears, and dire wolves joined the growing list of extinct species that would never again roam the North American landscape. The causes of these extinctions remain debated among scientists, with climate change and human hunting pressure both contributing to the demographic collapse of megafauna populations. The rapid warming of the Balling-Alarod period altered vegetation communities and disrupted migration routes that many large animals had followed for millennia. However, the correlation between human arrival and extinction timing suggests that hunting pressure was the primary factor driving most species to extinction. The combination of naive prey behavior and highly efficient human hunting technologies created conditions where even large, reproductively slow species could be driven to extinction within centuries. The extinction of megafauna had cascading effects on entire ecosystems. Large herbivores had shaped vegetation communities through their feeding behaviors, creating the mosaic landscapes that characterized much of the Pleistocene world. The disappearance of these ecosystem engineers allowed vegetation communities to develop in new directions, with forests expanding into areas that had previously been maintained as grasslands by herbivore grazing. These vegetation changes affected small animal populations and altered fire regimes, soil development patterns, and hydrological systems across vast areas. Human populations that had specialized in megafauna hunting were forced to adapt rapidly to the changing resource base. Archaeological sites from the late Pleistocene show evidence of increasing dietary diversification as large game animals became scarce. Tool assemblages began, including more implements designed for processing plant materials, small game, and aquatic resources. Settlement patterns shifted toward locations that provided access to diverse resource bases, rather than focusing primarily on large animal migration routes. The stress experienced by megafauna populations during this period was not limited to North America. European populations of woolly rhinoceros, cave bears, and giant deer also faced increasing pressure from both climate change and expanding human populations. The cave bear populations that had dominated European cave systems for hundreds of thousands of years began declining rapidly during the Balling-Alarod period. These massive ursids, specialized for plant-based diets, struggled to adapt to changing vegetation communities and increase competition with human populations for cave resources. The giant deer, with their enormous antler spreads that had evolved as displays of genetic fitness, found themselves increasingly vulnerable in the changing post-glacial landscapes. The energy requirements for growing and carrying antlers exceeding 3 m in span became prohibitive as food resources became less predictable and abundant. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of systematic hunting of giant deer by human populations equipped with increasingly sophisticated projectile technologies. Specialized cold-adapted predators also face severe challenges as their prey bases shifted and human populations expanded into their territories. Cave lions, which had evolved hunting strategies specifically adapted for taking down megafauna in open environments, struggled to adapt to the changing prey communities and increasing forest cover. Their large body size, which had been advantageous for hunting mammoth and rhinoceros, became a liability as smaller, more agile prey species became dominant in many ecosystems. The spotted hyena populations of Europe, which had thrived by scavenging from both large predator kills and human hunting sites, faced reduced opportunities as megafauna populations declined. These adaptable carnivores had survived previous climate fluctuations by exploiting diverse food sources. But the combination of reduced large carcass availability and competition with expanding human populations created unprecedented challenges. Archaeological evidence suggests that hyena populations began contracting towards southern refugia as their northern territories became dominated by human communities. Human technological innovations during this period reflected the changing environmental conditions and resource availability. The development of more sophisticated fishing technologies enabled exploitation of aquatic resources that became increasingly important as terrestrial megafauna disappeared. Bone and antler fish hooks, some featuring barbed designs that prevented fish from escaping, appear in archaeological assemblages throughout Europe and North America. Fish weirs and traps, constructed from organic materials that rarely preserve in the archaeological record, likely became crucial technologies for communities adapting to post-megafauna environments. The production of microliths, small geometric stone tools that could be hafted together to create composite implements, increased dramatically during this period. These technologies enabled more efficient use of raw materials while providing the versatility necessary for exploiting diverse resource bases. Microlith assemblages could be rapidly reconfigured for different tasks, from processing plant materials to creating specialized hunting implements for different prey species. The standardization of microlith production across wide geographic areas suggests extensive cultural communication and possibly trade networks that facilitated adaptation to changing conditions. Plant processing technologies became increasingly sophisticated as human populations adapted to reduced availability of large game animals. Grinding stones and mortars, designed for processing nuts, seeds, and other plant materials, appear more frequently in archaeological assemblages from this period. Some sites preserve evidence of systematic acorn processing, including leaching facilities designed to remove toxic tannins from nuts before consumption. These technologies enabled human populations to exploit plant resources that required extensive processing but provided reliable carbohydrate sources during seasons when animal resources were scarce. The social implications of these technological and environmental changes were profound. Communities that had organized their entire social systems around megafauna hunting were forced to develop new forms of social organization adapted to more diverse subsistence strategies. The reduced predictability of large game hunting may have encouraged the development of more egalitarian social structures, where resource sharing and cooperation became essential for community survival. Archaeological evidence suggests that burial practices became less elaborate during this period, possibly reflecting reduced social stratification as communities focused on collective adaptation to changing conditions. The warming trends that had characterized the Balling Alarod period came to an abrupt and catastrophic end around 12,900 years ago. Within the span of a few decades, temperatures across the North Atlantic region plummeted back toward full glacial conditions, triggering one of the most dramatic climate reversals in Earth's recent history. This period, known as the Younger Dryas, after the Arctic wildflower Dryas octopetala, that became dominant across newly frigid landscapes, represented a shocking return to near glacial conditions that caught both human populations and natural ecosystems completely unprepared for such rapid environmental transformation. The trigger for this climatic catastrophe likely originated from the massive Lake Agassiz, a glacial lake that had formed along the southern margin of the retreating Laurentide ice sheet. This enormous body of water, larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined, had been contained by ice dams that held back approximately 163,000 cubic kilometers of fresh water. As the Balling Alarod warming continued melting the ice sheet margins, these natural dams became increasingly unstable. When they finally failed around 12,900 years ago, the resulting flood released more fresh water into the North Atlantic system than any event in recorded geological history. The freshwater pulse from Lake Agassiz's catastrophic drainage fundamentally disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation that had been driving the Balling Alarod warming. The enormous volume of fresh water, estimated at nearly 100 times the annual flow of the Amazon River, spread across the surface of the North Atlantic and dramatically reduced surface water salinity. This diluted surface layer became too buoyant to sink and formed the deep water masses that normally drove northward heat transport. Within decades, the Gulf Stream weakened dramatically and shifted southward, cutting off the warm water supply that had been moderating European and North American climates. The collapse of Atlantic circulation triggered a cascade of atmospheric changes that amplified the cooling effects across the entire northern hemisphere. Sea ice formation accelerated rapidly across the North Atlantic, creating a feedback loop where increased ice cover reflected more solar radiation back to space, further cooling regional temperatures. The polar front, which had retreated northward during the Balling Alarod period, surged southward again, bringing Arctic air masses deep into temperate latitudes. Storm tracks shifted dramatically, altering precipitation patterns and creating drought conditions across regions that had recently experienced increased moisture availability. Temperature reconstructions from Greenland ice cores reveal the extraordinary rapidity of this climate transition. Annual average temperatures dropped by 15 degrees Celsius within a single decade, returning Greenland to conditions colder than those of the last glacial maximum. European temperatures fell by 8 to 12 degrees Celsius across most regions, while North American cooling was similarly severe. These temperature changes occurred so rapidly that individual trees recorded the transition in their annual growth rings, with some specimens showing dramatic growth reductions that began within specific growing seasons. The Fennoscandian ice sheet, which had been retreating steadily during the Balling-Alarod warming, began advancing again as renewed snowfall accumulated faster than summer melting could remove it. Glaciers that had retreated hundreds of kilometers from their maximum positions began flowing forward again, bulldozing the pioneer vegetation communities that had colonized the recently deglaciated terrain. The ice sheet margins advanced southward across Scandinavia and into the Baltic region, destroying human settlements and forcing populations to abandon territories they had occupied for centuries. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet stabilized and began limited re-advancement in some sectors, though it never returned to its full glacial maximum extent. The ice sheet's southern margin, which had been retreating northward through the Great Lakes region, stabilized and in some areas advanced southward again. Mountain glaciers throughout the Rocky Mountains and other high elevation regions began growing rapidly as increased snowfall and reduced summer melting created conditions favorable for ice accumulation. These alpine glaciers carved fresh moraines and modified valley systems that had been ice-free during the preceding warming period. The vegetation response to younger Dryas cooling was swift and dramatic. The forests that had expanded northward during the Balling-Alarod period died back rapidly as temperatures dropped below their tolerance limits. Pollen records from lake sediments show the replacement of temperate tree species by cold-adapted shrubs and herbs within decades of the cooling onset. The tree line retreated southward by hundreds of kilometers, abandoning vast areas to tundra and steppe vegetation communities that could tolerate the renewed harsh conditions. Dryas octopetala, the small Arctic wildflower that gives this period its name, became dominant across landscapes that had recently supported diverse forest communities. This hardy plant, adapted to extreme cold and short growing seasons, spread rapidly across the newly frigid terrain. Its distinctive 8-petaled white flowers became symbolic of the harsh conditions that characterized this climatic reversal, marking the transformation of temperate landscapes into Arctic environments within human lifetimes. The megafauna populations that had survived the initial wave of extinctions during human expansion faced renewed pressure from both climate change and continued human predation. Woolly mammoths, which had retreated to refugial populations in northern regions, found their remaining habitats further constrained by advancing ice sheets and changing vegetation communities. The mammoth steppe ecosystems that had supported these giants during the full glacial period failed to re-establish themselves completely as the younger Dryas climate was both colder and more arid than previous glacial conditions. European populations of woolly rhinoceros, already reduced to scattered groups in eastern regions, faced complete habitat loss as steppe environments contracted and human hunting pressure intensified. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of systematic exploitation of the remaining rhinoceros populations, with specialized hunting techniques developed specifically for taking down these massive animals. The combination of climate stress and human predation proved fatal for European rhinoceros populations, which disappeared entirely during the Younger Dryas period. Giant deer populations, which had been declining since the Balling-Alarod warming began altering their preferred woodland grassland mosaic habitats, faced accelerated extinction during the Younger Dryas cooling. The energy requirements for maintaining their enormous antlers became prohibitive as food resources became scarce and unpredictable. Archaeological evidence suggests that human populations specifically targeted male giant deer during the autumn rutting season, when the animals were most vulnerable, contributing to the demographic collapse of remaining populations. Cave bear populations, already stressed by competition with humans for cave resources and changing vegetation communities, suffered final extinction during the early Younger Dryas period. These massive ursids, specialized for plant-based diets, could not adapt quickly enough to the rapidly changing environmental conditions. Their cave systems, which had provided crucial winter shelter for thousands of years, were increasingly occupied by human populations who possessed superior technologies for exploiting diverse food resources during harsh winter conditions. Human populations across the affected regions faced unprecedented challenges as the climate deteriorated rapidly. Communities that had expanded into newly available territories during the Balling Alarod warming found themselves trapped in increasingly hostile environments as ice sheets advanced and vegetation communities collapsed. Many settlements established on recently deglaciated terrain had to be abandoned as glaciers re-advanced and permafrost returned to areas that had been experiencing soil development and forest growth. The Hamburgian culture populations of Northern Europe, who successfully colonized the southern margins of Scandinavia during the warming period, were forced to retreat southward as ice sheets advanced and their specialized reindeer hunting territories became inaccessible. Archaeological evidence shows rapid abandonment of northern sites and concentration of populations in more southern refugial areas. The cultural continuity maintained during this retreat demonstrates remarkable social cohesion and adaptive planning that enabled these communities to survive the climatic catastrophe. Technological innovations during the Younger Dryas period reflected the urgent need to adapt to deteriorating conditions and reduced resource availability. The development of more efficient hunting technologies became crucial as game animals became scarcer and more difficult to locate. Composite projectile points, incorporating multiple materials, became more sophisticated with careful attention to weight distribution and aerodynamic properties that maximized effectiveness with minimal raw material investment. Some assemblages show evidence of point recycling and resharpening that indicates careful conservation of valuable lithic resources. Fishing technologies expanded dramatically during this period as terrestrial resources became less reliable. Archaeological sites preserve evidence of increasingly sophisticated fish weirs, traps, and processing facilities that enable communities to exploit aquatic resources more systematically. Bonefish hooks became more standardized and specialized with different designs optimized for specific fish species and fishing techniques. Some sites show evidence of seasonal fish processing operations where large quantities of fish were dried and stored for winter consumption. Plant processing technologies also became more sophisticated as communities sought to extract maximum nutrition from increasingly limited plant resources. Grinding stone assemblages show evidence of intensive use and careful maintenance that suggests plant foods have become crucial components of subsistence strategies. Some sites preserve evidence of systematic acorn processing operations, including elaborate leaching systems designed to remove toxic compounds from nuts before consumption. The investment of labor in these processing technologies indicates that plant foods had become essential rather than supplementary dietary components. Storage technologies achieved new levels of sophistication as communities needed to buffer against increasingly unpredictable resource availability. Archaeological sites preserve evidence of constructed storage facilities, including stone-lined pits and elevated platforms, designed to protect stored foods from moisture and scavengers. Some storage systems incorporated multiple chambers that may have been used for different types of preserved foods, suggesting systematic approaches to food security that required long-term planning and resource management. The social implications of Younger Dryas environmental stress appear in changing settlement patterns and site organization. Communities became more aggregated with larger sites, showing evidence of increased population density and more intensive occupation. This aggregation likely reflected both the reduced availability of suitable habitation areas and the advantages of cooperative resource sharing during harsh conditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that territorial boundaries became more fluid as communities were forced to exploit wider areas to obtain sufficient resources. Trade networks that had developed during the Balling-Alarad period contracted significantly as transportation became more difficult and communities focused on immediate survival needs. The distribution of exotic raw materials shows reduced geographic scope, with most communities relying primarily on locally available resources. However, some high-value materials continued to move across significant distances, suggesting that certain trade relationships were maintained despite the challenging conditions. These persistent exchange networks may have been crucial for obtaining specialized tools and raw materials that were essential for survival in deteriorating environments. Artistic production during the Younger Dryas period shows evidence of both continuity and adaptation to changing conditions. Cave art traditions continued in some regions, though the subject matter shifted to emphasize animals that remained available rather than the megafauna species that were disappearing. Portable art objects became smaller and more standardized, possibly reflecting the need for mobility and the reduced availability of raw materials. Some artistic traditions show evidence of increased symbolic complexity, possibly reflecting the development of more sophisticated communication systems needed to coordinate survival strategies across scattered communities. Burial practices during this period show evidence of both continuity with earlier traditions and adaptations to changing social conditions. Some sites preserve evidence of increasingly elaborate mortuary treatments that may reflect attempts to maintain social cohesion and cultural identity during times of extreme stress. However, other sites show simplified burial practices that suggest communities were focusing their energy and resources on immediate survival needs rather than elaborate ceremonial activities. The Younger Dryas period also witnessed the emergence of new cultural traditions that would prove crucial for human survival and eventual expansion. In the Levant, the Natufian culture began developing during the later Younger Dryas period, representing a crucial transition towards sedentary lifestyles and intensive resource exploitation. These communities established permanent settlements around reliable resource concentrations, particularly stands of wild cereals that could be harvested systematically. The Natufian settlements at sites like Ain Malaha and Wadi Hama 27 preserve evidence of substantial stone architecture and storage facilities that indicate year-round occupation and systematic food production activities. Natufian technology included specialized harvesting tools designed for efficient collection of wild cereal grains. Sickle blades with distinctive silica polish from cutting grass stems appear in large numbers at Natufian sites, along with grinding stones and mortars designed for processing harvested grains. These technological innovations enabled systematic exploitation of wild plant resources on scales that approached agricultural production, though true domestication had not yet occurred. The investment in specialized plant processing equipment indicates that these communities had made fundamental commitments to intensive plant exploitation that distinguished them from earlier hunter-gatherer traditions. The social organization of Natufian communities shows evidence of increased complexity and hierarchy that may have emerged from the need to coordinate intensive resource exploitation activities. Some sites preserve evidence of differential burial treatments and house sizes that suggest emerging social stratification. The coordination required for systematic harvesting, processing, and storage of wild cereals may have necessitated more complex decision-making structures and resource allocation systems than those found in earlier hunter-gatherer societies. As the Younger Dryas period continued, human populations demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptive capability in the face of deteriorating environmental conditions. The technological innovations, social adaptations, and cultural developments that emerged during this crisis period would prove crucial for human survival and eventual expansion as climate conditions began to improve. The foundations for agricultural development, permanent settlement, and complex social organization were being laid even as communities struggled to survive in one of the most challenging climatic periods in recent human history. The abrupt termination of the Younger Dryas occurred with the same shocking rapidity that had characterized its onset. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures across the North Atlantic region began rising at rates that exceeded even the dramatic warming of the Balling Allerod period. Greenland ice core's record temperature increases of 10 degrees Celsius within a single decade, while European regions experienced warming of 7 to 12 degrees Celsius that transformed frozen tundra landscapes into temperate environments within human lifetimes. This final deglaciation represented not merely another climate oscillation, but the definitive end of the Pleistocene Ice Age and the beginning of the Holocene epoch that continues today. The trigger for this ultimate warming appears to have been a resumption of Atlantic meridional overturning circulation as the fresh water from the Younger Dryas meltwater pulse was gradually absorbed into the deep ocean system. Once surface salinity in the North Atlantic returned to levels that could support deep water formation, the circulation system re-established itself with remarkable vigor. The renewed northward transport of warm tropical waters rapidly melted the sea ice that had accumulated during the Younger Dryas, creating positive feedback loops that accelerated the warming process. Within decades, the Gulf Stream had returned to its full strength and was delivering unprecedented quantities of heat to European and North American coastal regions. The Laurentide ice sheet, already weakened by millennia of gradual ablation and the dramatic fluctuations of the preceding period, began experiencing catastrophic collapse across multiple sectors simultaneously. The ice sheet's southern margins, which had stabilized during the Younger Dryas, resumed their northward retreat at accelerated rates. Ice streams flowing through the Great Lakes region accelerated dramatically as rising temperatures and increased precipitation created conditions that promoted rapid ice flow. The massive ice lobes that had occupied the Lake Superior and Lake Michigan basins began retreating at rates exceeding several hundred meters per year, leaving behind the distinctive glacial landforms that characterized the modern Great Lakes region. The collapse of ice dams that had contained vast glacial lakes triggered some of the largest floods in Earth's history. Lake Missoula, impounded behind ice dams in western Montana, burst catastrophically when rising temperatures weakened the glacial barriers. The resulting Missoula floods carved the distinctive channeled scablands of eastern Washington, where massive volumes of water moving at velocities exceeding 100 kilometers per hour stripped away hundreds of meters of sediment and bedrock. These floods, recurring dozens of times as ice dams reformed and failed repeatedly, created landscape features so dramatic that early geologists struggled to explain their formation through conventional processes. Similar catastrophic drainage events occurred across the northern regions as ice sheet retreat exposed vast quantities of impounded water. The drainage of glacial Lake Agassiz, which had triggered the Younger Dryas cooling, resumed on an even larger scale as the final ice dams failed. The routing of this drainage shifted from the North Atlantic to the Arctic Ocean and eventually to the Gulf of Mexico through the emerging Mississippi River system, creating massive sediment plumes that extended hundreds of kilometers into the Gulf waters. These drainage events not only carved distinctive geological features, but also transported enormous quantities of freshwater and sediment into ocean basins, affecting marine ecosystems and circulation patterns across vast areas. The retreat of the Fennoscandian ice sheet proceeded with similar rapidity, exposing the Baltic Sea basin and creating the complex system of lakes and seas that characterizes modern Scandinavia. The Baltic region experienced a series of distinct phases as retreating ice created different drainage configurations. Initially, the Baltic ice lake formed as melting ice created a large freshwater body trapped between the retreating ice margin and a higher ground to the south. As ice retreat continued, this lake drained catastrophically into the North Sea, creating the Eocene phase characterized by marine conditions and distinctive fauna. Subsequent isostatic rebound and continued ice retreat created the Ancylus Lake phase before the final establishment of modern Baltic Sea conditions. The massive quantities of water released during deglaciation caused global sea levels to rise at unprecedented rates. The total rise of 120 m from glacial maximum to modern levels occurred primarily during this period of rapid deglaciation, with rates reaching several meters per century during the most intense phases of ice sheet collapse. This dramatic sea level rise fundamentally transformed global geography, drowning vast areas of continental shelf that had been exposed throughout the glacial period. The Bering Land Bridge disappeared beneath rising waters around 11,000 years ago, severing the connection between Asia and North America that had existed for tens of thousands of years. Human populations on both sides of the newly formed Bering Strait found themselves isolated on separate continents for the first time since the initial colonization of the Americas. Doggerland, the vast plain that had connected Britain to continental Europe throughout the glacial period, experienced gradual inundation as North Sea levels rose. This process occurred over several millennia, allowing human populations time to adapt to the changing coastlines through technological innovations and settlement relocations. Archaeological evidence from the North Sea reveals extensive occupation of Doggerland during the early Holocene, with fishing communities exploiting the rich marine resources of the shallow seas that gradually expanded across the region. These populations developed sophisticated boat technologies and navigation skills that enabled them to maintain contact between increasingly isolated land areas as sea levels continued rising. The English Channel formed through the catastrophic breach of the Chalk Ridge that had connected the Dover Cliffs to the Calais region. The enormous volumes of meltwater draining from the retreating ice sheets eventually overtopped this natural barrier, creating massive waterfalls that rapidly eroded the chalk bedrock. The resulting channel carved within centuries or possibly decades created the permanent separation between Britain and continental Europe that characterizes modern geography. This dramatic geological event forced human populations to develop maritime technologies for maintaining contact across the newly formed water barrier. Southeast Asia experienced equally dramatic transformations as rising seas inundated the vast Sundaland plain that had connected the modern Indonesian archipelago. The shallow seas between Java, Sumatra, and Borneo deepened rapidly as global sea levels rose, creating the complex island geography that characterizes modern Indonesia. Human populations that had spread across the Sundaland during the glacial period found themselves increasingly isolated on separate islands, leading to the development of distinct cultural traditions and technological adaptations. The maritime skills that these populations developed for inter-island communication and trade would eventually enable the remarkable seafaring expansions that carried human populations across the Pacific Ocean to remote islands thousands of kilometers from the nearest land. The rapid environmental changes accompanying deglaciation created unprecedented challenges for surviving megafauna populations. The mammoth steppe ecosystems that had supported vast herds of large herbivores throughout the glacial period fragmented rapidly as forest communities expanded into previously open landscapes. Woolly mammoths, already reduced to scattered populations by earlier extinctions, found their remaining habitats increasingly constrained by expanding forests and human settlements. The last mainland mammoth populations disappeared from Siberia around 10,000 years ago, though isolated populations survived on Wrangel Island until approximately 4,000 years ago. The final extinction wave eliminated most remaining Pleistocene megafauna species that had survived previous climate fluctuations and human expansion. Giant ground sloths, which had thrived in South American ecosystems for millions of years, disappeared rapidly as human populations expanded throughout the continent and climate change altered vegetation communities. These massive xenarthrans, some weighing over 4,000 kilograms, had been ecosystem engineers that maintained open grassland habitats through their feeding behaviors. Their extinction allowed forest communities to expand into areas that had been grasslands for millennia, fundamentally altering South American biogeography. European cave bears, which had already suffered severe population declines during the Younger Dryas, became completely extinct during the early Holocene as their specialized cave habitats were increasingly occupied by expanding human populations. These massive ursids had coexisted with humans for tens of thousands of years, but the combination of climate change, habitat loss, and direct competition for cave resources proved fatal for the remaining populations. Their extinction marked the end of one of Europe's most distinctive Pleistocene species and eliminated a major component of European cave ecosystems. The disappearance of megafauna had cascading effects on vegetation communities and ecosystem structure across all continents. Large herbivores had maintained grassland and savanna ecosystems through their grazing activities, preventing forest encroachment and maintaining habitat diversity. Without these ecosystem engineers, forest communities expanded rapidly into previously open areas, creating more homogeneous landscapes with reduced habitat diversity. The loss of large predators that had specialized in hunting megafauna created opportunities for smaller predator species while eliminating the selective pressures that had shaped herbivore evolution for millions of years. Human populations responded to these environmental transformations through remarkable cultural innovations that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human development. The most significant of these innovations was the development of agriculture, which emerged independently in multiple regions during the early Holocene as human communities began systematically manipulating plant and animal species to increase their productivity and reliability. The transition from hunting and gathering to agricultural production represented one of the most profound transformations in human history, enabling population growth, permanent settlement, and the development of complex social institutions. The earliest evidence for agricultural development appears in the Levant around 11,500 years ago, when Natufian communities began cultivating wild cereals that had been harvested intensively during the Younger Dryas period. The pre-pottery Neolithic settlements at sites like Jericho and Negev Hagdud preserve evidence of systematic cultivation of emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, and barley. These early farmers developed specialized tools for land preparation, planting, and harvesting that enabled much more intensive production than had been possible through gathering wild plants. Storage facilities at these sites could hold tons of processed grain, indicating production levels that far exceeded immediate consumption needs. The domestication process involved subtle but crucial genetic changes in cultivated plants that made them more suitable for human use, while simultaneously making them dependent on human care for survival. Wild cereals possess shattering seed heads that disperse seeds naturally when ripe, but early farmers selected for plants with non-shattering heads that retain their seeds until harvesting. This selection process, occurring over many generations of cultivation, created domesticated varieties that could not survive without human intervention, but produced much larger and more reliable harvests than their wild ancestors. Animal domestication began simultaneously with plant cultivation as human communities started managing wild animal populations more intensively. The earliest domesticated animals were dogs, which had been selectively bred from wolf populations during the late Pleistocene. However, the early Holocene witnessed the domestication of sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs in various regions as human communities developed systematic animal husbandry practices. These domesticated animals provided reliable sources of meat, milk, hides, and other materials, while also serving as living storage systems that could convert inedible plant materials into valuable protein sources. The goats and sheep domesticated in the Levant around 10,500 years ago represented the first successful domestication of ungulate species. These animals, selected from wild populations of Bezoar goats and Mouflon sheep, underwent physical and behavioral changes that made them more docile and productive under human management. Domesticated goats developed longer hair and different horn configurations than their wild ancestors, while sheep developed woolly coats that provided valuable fiber for textile production. The management of these herds required sophisticated understanding of animal behavior, seasonal grazing patterns, and breeding strategies that represented major advances in biological knowledge. Agricultural communities developed increasingly complex social organizations to coordinate the labor-intensive activities required for successful farming. The seasonal demands of agriculture, from land preparation through harvesting and storage, required careful planning and coordinated effort from multiple individuals. This coordination necessitated new forms of social organization, including specialized roles, leadership structures, and resource allocation systems that differed fundamentally from the more egalitarian organizations of hunter-gatherer societies. Archaeological evidence from early agricultural settlements shows increasing social differentiation, including differential house sizes, burial treatments, and access to exotic materials. The Catalhoek settlement in central Anatolia, occupied from approximately 9,400 to 8,000 years ago, represents one of the most remarkable early agricultural communities. This site, covering 13 hectares and housing an estimated 8,000 people, consisted of densely packed rectangular houses constructed from mud brick and timber. The houses were accessed through openings in their roofs, with movement between structures occurring across flat rooftops that served as the community's primary circulation system. This unique architectural arrangement created a highly integrated community where individual households maintained privacy while participating in complex social networks. The interior organization of Catalhoek houses revealed sophisticated understanding of space utilization and symbolic organization. Each house contained multiple rooms, including sleeping areas, storage facilities, and workspaces arranged around central hearths that heated and cooking facilities. The walls were decorated with elaborate paintings depicting hunting scenes, geometric patterns, and symbolic representations that indicate complex belief systems and artistic traditions. Some rooms contained platforms and installations that appear to have served ceremonial functions, suggesting that religious activities were integrated into domestic life. The economic organization of Catalhoek involved specialized production activities, including obsidian tool manufacturing, textile production, and ceramic manufacture. The community's location near obsidian sources in the Cappadocian volcanic region enabled large-scale tool production that supplied communities throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence shows standardized production techniques and quality control measures that indicate systematic craft specialization. The distribution of obsidian tools from Catalhoek extends over 1,000 kilometers, demonstrating the development of long-distance trade networks that connected early agricultural communities across vast distances. Similar agricultural developments occurred independently in other regions as local human populations adapted cultivation techniques to their specific environmental conditions and available plant species. In China, rice cultivation began in the Yangtze River Valley around 9,000 years ago as communities started managing wild rice populations more intensively. The earliest evidence comes from sites like Kwahookio and Shongshan, where archaeological deposits preserve rice remains, showing gradual morphological changes indicating increasing human selection pressure. Chinese agricultural communities also domesticated millet in northern regions. creating agricultural systems adapted to different climatic conditions and soil types. The development of rice agriculture required sophisticated water management techniques, including irrigation systems, terracing, and flood control measures. Early rice farmers developed methods for creating artificial wetlands that could maintain optimal water levels throughout the growing season while preventing soil erosion and nutrient loss. These water management systems required coordinated community effort and long-term planning that necessitated complex social organizations and technical knowledge systems. The success of rice agriculture enabled population densities that far exceeded those possible through hunting and gathering, creating the demographic foundation for the complex civilizations that would emerge in China. Maize agriculture developed in Mesoamerica around 9,000 years ago through the domestication of teosinte, a wild grass that bears little resemblance to modern corn. The transformation of teosinte into maize required thousands of years of selective breeding that dramatically altered plant architecture, seed production, and nutritional content. Early maize farmers in the Balsas River Valley of Mexico developed cultivation techniques that enabled this relatively unproductive wild plant to become one of the world's most important food crops. The domestication process involved selecting for plants with larger seeds, non-shattering seed heads, and synchronous ripening that made harvesting more efficient. The spread of maize agriculture throughout the Americas required adaptation to diverse environmental conditions, from tropical lowlands to high-altitude mountain valleys. Different varieties of maize were developed for specific climatic conditions, with some adapted to short growing seasons at high altitudes, while others were optimized for tropical conditions with year-round growing potential. These adaptations enabled maize-based agricultural systems to support human populations across virtually the entire range of environments found in the Americas, from southern Canada to southern Chile. Potato domestication in the Andes around 8,000 years ago created another crucial agricultural system adapted to high-altitude environments. The wild potato species of the Andes were highly toxic and required sophisticated processing techniques to remove harmful alkaloids before consumption. Early Andean farmers developed freeze-drying techniques that utilized the extreme temperature fluctuations of high-altitude environments to create preserved potato products that could be stored for years. These preservation techniques enabled Andean communities to buffer against crop failures and maintain stable food supplies despite the challenging environmental conditions of high-altitude agriculture. The technological innovations accompanying agricultural development included advances in tool manufacturing, construction techniques, and material processing that enabled more intensive resource exploitation. Groundstone tools became increasingly common as agricultural communities needed implements for processing large quantities of grain and other plant materials. Grinding stones, mortars, and pestles achieved new levels of sophistication with carefully shaped working surfaces that maximized processing efficiency. Some grinding installations were permanently constructed features that served entire communities and required coordinated maintenance and operation. Ceramic technology developed rapidly in agricultural communities as the need for storage, cooking, and serving vessels increased dramatically. The earliest pottery appears in China around 20,000 years ago, but ceramic production became widespread only with the development of agricultural settlements that required large-scale food storage and processing capabilities. Early agricultural ceramics included massive storage jars capable of holding hundreds of liters of grain, specialized cooking vessels designed for processing agricultural products, and serving vessels that reflected increasing social differentiation and ceremonial activities. The production of textiles from domesticated animal fibers and cultivated plant materials created new technologies and economic opportunities. Sheep wool, which became available only after animal domestication, provided superior fiber for textile production compared to the plant materials and wild animal hairs used by earlier communities. The development of spinning and weaving technologies enabled the production of clothing, blankets, and other textile products that provided better protection against environmental conditions, while also serving as markers of social status and cultural identity. Human settlements during this period achieved unprecedented size and permanence as agricultural production enabled year-round occupation of fixed locations. The largest agricultural settlements housed thousands of people in complex arrangements of residential, storage, and ceremonial structures. These communities required sophisticated planning and organization to manage water supplies, waste disposal, defense, and social coordination among large populations. The development of permanent architecture using stone, mud brick, and timber created buildings that could house multiple generations and serve as focal points for community identity and cultural transmission. The social changes accompanying agricultural development included the emergence of specialized roles, hierarchical organization, and institutionalized leadership that distinguished agricultural societies from earlier hunter-gatherer communities. Agricultural production created surplus resources that could support individuals who did not directly participate in food production, enabling the development of craft specialists, religious leaders, and administrative personnel. These specialized roles required new forms of social organization and resource allocation that laid the foundation for the complex political systems that would characterize later civilizations. The retreat of the great ice sheets marked not merely the end of a climatic epoch, but the beginning of an extraordinary period of scientific discovery that would eventually reveal the detailed history of our planet's most recent ice age. As agricultural societies flourished and human populations expanded across newly available territories, the geological evidence of the Pleistocene remained locked in ice, sediment, and stone, waiting for future generations to develop the technologies necessary to decode these ancient environmental archives. The legacy of the last ice age extends far beyond its immediate effects on human evolution and migration, creating a vast repository of climate data that modern scientists have only recently learned to interpret with precision. The most remarkable preservation of ice age conditions occurs in the massive ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, where annual snow accumulation has created layer upon layer of compressed ice extending back hundreds of thousands of years. These ice cores function as frozen libraries, preserving detailed records of atmospheric composition, temperature fluctuations, volcanic eruptions, and even seasonal weather patterns from throughout the Pleistocene period. The Greenland Ice Sheet Project 2, completed in 1993, extracted ice cores reaching depths of 3,053 m, providing annual resolution climate data extending back 110,000 years. Each layer in these cores contains microscopic air bubbles that preserve samples of ancient atmosphere, enabling scientists to measure prehistoric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases with extraordinary precision. The analysis of these atmospheric samples has revealed that carbon dioxide levels during the last glacial maximum reached approximately 180 parts per million compared to pre-industrial levels of 280 parts per million and current concentrations exceeding 420 parts per million. The ice cores also preserve evidence of massive volcanic eruptions, including the Tobas supervolcano, through elevated sulfuric acid concentrations that correspond precisely with geological evidence from the eruption site. Microscopic dust particles trapped in the ice provide information about wind patterns, storm intensity, and the geographic sources of atmospheric dust during different climatic periods. The isotopic composition of ice core samples enables reconstruction of past temperatures with remarkable accuracy. The ratio of heavy oxygen isotopes to normal oxygen in ancient ice reflects the temperature conditions when the original snow fell, creating a thermometer that extends back through multiple glacial cycles. These temperature reconstructions reveal that Greenland experienced temperature fluctuations of 15 to 20 degrees Celsius during Dansgaard-Oeschger cycles, with some transitions occurring within single decades. The rapidity of these climate changes, documented with annual precision in ice cores, demonstrates that Earth's climate system can shift between dramatically different states far more quickly than previously imagined. Marine sediment cores extracted from ocean floors worldwide provide complementary records of ice age conditions through the microscopic remains of marine organisms that responded to changing ocean temperatures and chemistry. Foraminifera, tiny marine protozoans with calcium carbonate shells, preserve isotopic signatures that reflect both ocean temperature and global ice volume when they were alive. The shells of these organisms, accumulating continuously on ocean floors for millions of years, create detailed records of marine conditions that can be correlated with ice core data to reconstruct global climate patterns. The most comprehensive marine climate record comes from the Ocean Drilling Program, which has extracted sediment cores from all major ocean basins. These cores reveal the complex interactions between ocean circulation, ice sheet dynamics, and atmospheric conditions that drove Pleistocene climate fluctuations. Heinrich events appear in North Atlantic sediment cores as distinctive layers of ice-rafted debris that document the massive iceberg discharges from the Laurentide ice sheet. The geographic distribution of these debris layers maps the pathways of Heinrich icebergs and reveals the enormous scale of ice sheet instability during the last glacial period. Coral reefs provide another crucial source of ice age climate data through their sensitivity to sea level and temperature changes. Fossil coral reefs exposed on modern coastlines document past sea levels with meter-scale precision, revealing the timing and magnitude of ice sheet growth and retreat. The Huon Peninsula in Papua New Guinea contains a spectacular sequence of uplifted coral terraces that record sea level fluctuations over the past 140,000 years. Each terrace represents a period of stable sea level when coral reefs could grow, while the elevation differences between terraces document the magnitude of sea level changes associated with glacial cycles. Uranium-thorium dating of fossil corals enables precise age determination for these sea level markers, creating a detailed chronology of ice sheet fluctuations. The coral record reveals that sea level rose approximately 120 m from the last glacial maximum to modern levels, with most of this rise occurring between 19,000 and 7,000 years ago during the period of major ice sheet collapse. The coral data also document rapid sea level fluctuations during the last interglacial period, when sea levels reached 69 m above present levels due to partial collapse of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. Lake sediment cores from around the world preserve detailed records of terrestrial climate changes through pollen assemblages, chemical compositions, and physical characteristics that reflect local environmental conditions. The pollen grains preserved in lake sediments document vegetation changes with extraordinary detail, enabling reconstruction of past temperature and precipitation patterns across entire continents. The European Pollen Database, compiled from hundreds of lake sites, reveals the complex patterns of vegetation migration that occurred as ice sheets advanced and retreated across the continent. These pollen records demonstrate that plant communities did not simply migrate northward and southward as coherent units during climate changes. Instead, individual species responded independently to changing conditions, creating novel plant associations that have no modern analogs. During the last glacial maximum, much of Central Europe supported steppe tundra vegetation dominated by herbs and grasses with scattered populations of cold-adapted trees surviving in favorable microenvironments. The rapidity of vegetation changes during deglaciation reveals that plant communities can reorganize completely within centuries when climate conditions change sufficiently. Speleothems, the calcium carbonate formations found in caves worldwide, provide high-resolution records of past precipitation and temperature through their chemical composition and growth patterns. Stalagmites and stalactites grow continuously over thousands of years, incorporating trace elements and isotopes that reflect the chemical composition of groundwater percolating through cave systems. The growth rates of speleothems vary with temperature and precipitation, creating annual growth bands similar to tree rings that enable precise dating of climate events. Chinese cave records from sites like Hulu Cave and Donga Cave document Asian monsoon variability over the past 200,000 years with subannual resolution. These records reveal that monsoon strength fluctuated dramatically during glacial periods, with Heinrich events in the North Atlantic triggering weakened monsoons across Asia within decades. The synchronization of climate changes between the North Atlantic and Asian monsoon systems demonstrates the global connectivity of ice age climate fluctuations and the rapid transmission of climate signals between different regions. The genetic legacy of ice age population bottlenecks and migrations remains embedded in the DNA of modern human populations, providing crucial information about prehistoric demographic events and population movements. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited exclusively through maternal lineages, preserves signatures of the population expansions that occurred as humans colonized different continents during the Pleistocene. The relatively low genetic diversity in non-African populations reflects the small founding groups that established human populations outside Africa, while the geographic distribution of genetic lineages traces the pathways of ancient migrations. Recent advances in ancient DNA extraction have enabled direct analysis of genetic material from Ice Age human remains, providing unprecedented insights into prehistoric population structure and interactions. The analysis of Neanderthal genomes from multiple sites across Europe reveals that modern non-African populations carry 1–3% Neanderthal DNA, documenting interbreeding events that occurred as expanding Homo sapiens populations encountered established Neanderthal communities. These genetic exchanges occurred primarily in the Middle East and Central Asia between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago, with different modern populations carrying distinct sets of Neanderthal genetic variants. Denisovan DNA, first identified from a finger bone discovered in Siberia's Denisova Cave, represents another archaic human lineage that contributed genes to modern populations. Denisovan genetic variants are most common in Melanesian and Australian Aboriginal populations, suggesting that interbreeding occurred in Southeast Asia as modern humans expanded toward Australia. Some Denisovan genetic variants appear to provide adaptive advantages in high-altitude environments, with Tibetan populations carrying Denisovan alleles that enhance oxygen metabolism at high elevations. The genetic evidence for Ice Age population bottlenecks extends beyond human populations to include many other species that experience severe demographic contractions during Pleistocene climate fluctuations. Cheetah populations show extremely low genetic diversity that reflects a severe bottleneck approximately 10,000 years ago, possibly related to the megafauna extinctions that eliminated much of their prey base. European bison populations carry genetic signatures of bottlenecks that correlate with Ice Age refugial periods when populations were confined to small areas of suitable habitat. Modern climate research increasingly relies on Ice Age data to understand natural climate variability and improve predictions of future climate change. The detailed records of past climate fluctuations provide crucial information about climate sensitivity, feedback mechanisms, and the potential for rapid climate transitions under different atmospheric compositions. Ice core data revealing rapid climate changes during the Pleistocene have fundamentally altered scientific understanding of climate system stability and the potential for abrupt climate shifts in response to greenhouse gas emissions. The paleoclimate record demonstrates that Earth's climate system has multiple stable states and can transition rapidly between them when critical thresholds are exceeded. The Younger Dryas period provides a particularly relevant example, showing how disruption of ocean circulation patterns can trigger rapid cooling despite overall warming trends. Modern climate models incorporate these paleoclimate insights to assess the potential for similar rapid transitions in response to current greenhouse gas emissions and ice sheet melting. Ice Age analogs are particularly valuable for understanding ice sheet behavior and sea level responses to warming temperatures. The last interglacial period, when global temperatures were 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial levels, provides insights into ice sheet stability under conditions similar to projected future warming. Paleoclimate evidence indicates that both the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets experienced significant melting during the last interglacial, contributing to sea level 6-9 m higher than present. These findings suggest that continued warming could trigger substantial ice sheet retreat and sea level rise over coming centuries. The timing and magnitude of ice sheet responses to past warming events inform projections of future sea level change. Paleoclimate data reveal that ice sheets can respond to warming with significant delays, continuing to retreat for millennia after initial warming begins. This lag effect suggests that current greenhouse gas emissions may commit Earth to substantial ice sheet retreat and sea level rise that will continue long after emissions are reduced. Cultural memories of Ice Age events persist in oral traditions and mythological accounts preserved by indigenous populations worldwide, providing additional insights into prehistoric environmental changes and human responses to dramatic climate fluctuations. Flood myths found in cultures across the globe may preserve memories of the catastrophic meltwater events that accompanied ice sheet collapse during deglaciation. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions describe landscapes and coastlines that correspond to geographic configurations that existed during lower sea levels of the Ice Age, suggesting that some cultural memories may extend back tens of thousands of years. Native American traditions from the Pacific Northwest describe massive floods and landscape changes that correspond closely with geological evidence for the Missoula floods that occurred during ice sheet retreat. These oral accounts preserve details about flood timing, magnitude, and geographic extent that complement scientific reconstructions of these events. The persistence of such detailed environmental information in oral traditions demonstrates the remarkable capacity of human cultures to preserve and transmit knowledge across many generations. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing new information about Ice Age human populations as melting glaciers and changing landscapes expose previously inaccessible sites. The retreat of alpine glaciers across the world has exposed numerous archaeological sites that were buried under ice for thousands of years. The discovery of Otzi the Iceman in the Austrian Alps in 1991 demonstrated the exceptional preservation possible in glacial environments, with organic materials including clothing, tools, and even stomach contents preserved intact for over 5,000 years. Similar discoveries continue as climate change accelerates glacier retreat worldwide. In Norway, retreating glaciers have exposed numerous artifacts from medieval and earlier periods, including complete arrows with wooden shafts and organic fletching preserved by ice. These discoveries provide unprecedented insights into ancient hunting technologies and demonstrate that high-altitude environments were more extensively used by human populations than previously recognized. Permafrost melting in Arctic regions is exposing archaeological sites that document human adaptations to Ice Age environments. Sites in Siberia and Alaska preserve organic materials, including wooden tools, basketry, and even complete human remains that provide detailed information about Ice Age technologies and lifeways. The Yana rhinoceros horn site in northern Siberia, exposed by permafrost melting, contains the northernmost evidence of human occupation during the Ice Age, with sophisticated bone and ivory tools demonstrating remarkable adaptations to extreme Arctic conditions. The ongoing exposure of Ice Age archaeological sites creates both opportunities and challenges for scientific research. While these discoveries provide unprecedented access to well-preserved materials, the rapid pace of glacier retreat and permafrost melting means that many sites are being exposed faster than they can be properly excavated and studied. Climate change is simultaneously revealing new information about Ice Age human populations while destroying other archaeological sites through erosion and environmental degradation. Underwater archaeology has revealed extensive evidence of human occupation on continental shelves that were exposed during Ice Age sea level lowering. The North Sea, English Channel, and other shallow marine areas contain numerous archaeological sites that document human adaptations to the exposed landscapes of Doggerland and other submerged regions. These underwater sites preserve evidence of fishing communities, tool manufacturing sites, and settlement areas that provide crucial information about human populations during the transition from Ice Age to modern conditions. The scientific legacy of Ice Age research extends beyond historical reconstruction to include fundamental advances in understanding Earth system processes and human evolutionary biology. The development of techniques for analyzing ice cores, marine sediments, and other paleoclimate archives has created new fields of scientific inquiry and analytical capabilities that inform research across multiple disciplines. Isotope geochemistry, developed largely through paleoclimate research, now provides tools for studying everything from atmospheric chemistry to biological metabolism. The integration of paleoclimate data with modern climate models has improved understanding of climate sensitivity and feedback mechanisms that operate on different timescales. Ice Age research has revealed the crucial importance of ice sheet dynamics, ocean circulation, and atmospheric chemistry in determining global climate patterns. These insights inform current efforts to predict future climate changes and assess the potential impacts of human activities on Earth's climate system. The study of Ice Age human evolution has fundamentally transformed understanding of human cognitive capabilities, technological innovation, and social organization. Archaeological evidence from Ice Age sites demonstrates that human populations possess sophisticated technologies, artistic traditions, and social systems tens of thousands of years earlier than previously recognized. These discoveries have extended the timeline of human cultural evolution and revealed the remarkable adaptability that enabled our species to survive and thrive during one of Earth's most challenging climatic periods. The last Ice Age represents far more than a historical curiosity or academic exercise in environmental reconstruction. The detailed records preserved in ice, sediment, and stone provide crucial insights into Earth system behavior that inform current efforts to understand and respond to ongoing climate change. The genetic legacy embedded in modern human populations documents the demographic consequences of environmental change and reveals the pathways through which our species colonize the globe. The technological and cultural innovations developed during the Ice Age laid the foundation for agricultural development and the complex civilizations that followed. Perhaps most importantly, the Ice Age record demonstrates both the fragility and resilience of human societies in the face of dramatic environmental change. The populations that survived the Toba catastrophe, adapted to the last glacial maximum, and thrived during deglaciation possessed the technological sophistication, social organization, and adaptive flexibility that enabled them to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. Their legacy preserved in our genes, our archaeological record, and the environmental archives they left behind provides both inspiration and practical guidance for addressing the environmental challenges that confront modern human societies. The story of the last Ice Age ultimately reveals the profound interconnectedness of climate, environment, and human society that continues to shape our world today. Understanding this legacy provides crucial perspective on humanity's relationship with Earth's climate system and the potential consequences of our ongoing modification of atmospheric composition. The Ice Age record serves as both a testament to human adaptability and a warning about the potential for rapid, dramatic environmental changes that can fundamentally alter the conditions for human civilization. In studying our Ice Age past, we gain essential insights for navigating our climatic future.